Hello and thank you for joining for today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is about the Dingonek, often dubbed the jungle walrus, is an aquatic cryptid from the rivers of southern Kenya and western Africa. The most famous recorded account of the creature comes from 1907, when English adventurer John Alfred Jordan claimed to have fired a .303 caliber rifle at a dingonek in the Migori River in Kenya. According to Jordan, the bullet merely angered the beast, forcing his hunting party to flee. The story follows a small, unlicensed expedition led by Julian Vane, a disgraced zoologist obsessed with the journals of John Alfred Jordan. He has convinced a team, including Sarah, a pragmatic field biologist, and Zachary, a local guide who is terrified of the river, to venture deep into the Kenyan interior to find a relict population of the Dingonek. The second story today is about the Minotaur, a fearsome creature from Greek mythology, commonly depicted as a hybrid with the muscular body of a man and the head and tail of a bull. Born to Queen Pasiphae of Crete, the man-eating beast was imprisoned by King Minos in the labyrinth, an inescapable, sprawling maze designed by the architect Daedalus. A group of 6 elite specialists, a linguist, a structural engineer, a combat veteran, and 3 wealthy financiers, are hired to enter a newly discovered sub-labyrinth beneath the ruins of Knossos. The financiers believe they are recovering lost art. The specialists are there to ensure they don't get lost. They are warned that the site is a living machine of corridors that shift slightly over centuries. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped if you would like to skip to the second story. And now for today's cryptid horror stories. I hope you all enjoy. The scale shedder. The first thing they noticed wasn't the creature, but the silence of the crocodiles. For 3 days, the river had been a churning chaos of predators, the surface broken constantly by the armored snouts of Nile crocodiles that had ruled the Migori for millennia, their presence as much a part of the landscape as the papyrus reeds and the acacia trees that lined the banks. The crocodiles had been everywhere, basking on sandbars with their jaws open in permanent grins, sliding into the water with a sound like wet leather, watching the expedition's boats with eyes that were older than the colonial borders that had tried to claim this land. They had been a presence, a threat, a constant reminder that the river was not a highway for human convenience but a domain ruled by forces that did not recognize the authority of maps or governments. But by Tuesday, not a single scale broke the surface of the Migori. Dr. Julian Vane stood at the bow of the expedition's single motorboat, his binoculars pressed to his eyes with a force that suggested he was trying to see through the river itself, to penetrate the brown water and find the crocodiles that had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. He was 58 years old, a zoologist who had once held a prestigious chair at the University of Nairobi and had lost it, not through scandal or incompetence, but through the slow erosion of academic credibility that came from pursuing topics that peer reviewers found embarrassing. He had spent 30 years searching for creatures that conventional science dismissed as folklore, and in those 30 years, he had learned that the boundary between the documented and the mythical was far more permeable than his colleagues were willing to admit. Julian was tall and gaunt, the kind of thin that came from decades of field work in places where food was scarce and the work was hard. His face was leathered by the African sun, a topographic map of wrinkles and scars that told the story of a life spent in pursuit of the impossible. His eyes, which were the color of strong tea, held a brightness that his detractors called obsession and his admirers called passion, and they scanned the river with an intensity that made the boat's pilot, a young Kenyan named Kofi, exchange nervous glances with the deckhand. "It's not natural," Julian said, not for the first time that morning. "The crocodiles don't just leave. They've been here since before humans arrived. They've survived droughts and floods and hunting and habitat destruction. Something drove them out." "Maybe they just moved upstream," said Sarah Okolo, the expedition's pragmatic field biologist. She was 42, sturdy and capable, with a face that had been shaped by the same sun that had weathered Julian's, but with a different result. Where Julian looked ascetic and driven, Sarah looked robust and grounded, a woman who knew the difference between scientific curiosity and self-destructive obsession. She had worked with Julian for 15 years, long enough to respect his knowledge and fear his judgment, and she had agreed to this expedition only after he had promised, with a sincerity that she had known even then was false, that they would turn back at the first sign of serious danger. "Crocodiles are territorial," Julian said, lowering his binoculars and turning to face her with an expression that bordered on pleading. "They're apex predators. They don't just move because they feel like it. Something scared them, something bigger, something that made them decide the Magori wasn't worth defending anymore." "The river hasn't gone dry," said Zachary Mwangi, their local guide, and his voice was the voice of a man who had grown up on this river and knew its moods the way a sailor knows the sea. He was 60, though he looked older, his skin weathered to the color and texture of the mahogany trees that grew along the upper reaches of the Magori. He had agreed to guide this expedition not out of any interest in Julian's theories, but because the money was good, and because he had a grandson whose school fees needed to be paid. But now, as the boat moved through water that was unnaturally still, his face held an expression that Sarah had never seen before, a mixture of fear and resignation, as if he had known all along that this journey would end badly. "The river hasn't gone dry," Zachary repeated, his eyes scanning the banks with a methodical thoroughness that suggested he was looking for something specific, something he hoped not to find. "It has simply been claimed." "Claimed?" Julian asked, and his voice took on the eager tone of a man who had just heard confirmation of his most cherished theory. "Claimed by what, Zachary?" Zachary did not answer. He simply shook his head and turned back to the river, his hands gripping the boat's railing with a force that made his knuckles white. The expedition was small, smaller than Julian would have liked, but funding had been difficult to secure, and his reputation had made most institutions reluctant to associate themselves with his work. Besides Julian and Sarah and Zachary, there were only two other members: Thomas, a graduate student from London who had volunteered for the expedition as part of his dissertation research on African megafauna, and two porters, brothers named David and Daniel, who had been hired in Nairobi, and who spoke little English but carried heavy loads with the stoic endurance of men who had learned long ago that complaining was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. They had been on the river for 5 days, traveling upstream from the last colonial outpost, a crumbling settlement that had once served as a trading post for ivory, and now served as a waypoint for the occasional researcher or adventure tourist who strayed too far from the established routes. The Magori was not a major river, not by African standards. It was a tributary of a tributary, a brown ribbon of water that wound through the Kenyan interior with a lazy meandering that suggested it had nowhere important to go. But it was old, older than the nations that claimed its banks, older than the tribes that had fished its waters for 10,000 years, and in its depths, Julian believed, it hid a secret that had been waiting since before humans learned to build boats. The Dingonek. The name came from the journals of John Alfred Jordan, a colonial officer who had claimed to encounter the creature in 1907 during a surveying expedition in what was then British East Africa. Jordan had described it as a massive, armored beast, 15 feet long or more, with a body covered in pangolin-like scales, a tail tipped with a heavy stinger, and fangs like those of a walrus that protruded from a broad, flat snout. He had fired on it, he claimed, and his bullets had ricocheted off its armor with a sound like hail on a tin roof. The creature had retreated into the river, and Jordan had returned to civilization with a story that was dismissed as the ravings of a man who had spent too long in the sun. But Julian had found other accounts. In the archives of the Nairobi Museum, he had discovered a collection of oral histories collected from local communities in the 1930s, stories that described a river king that ruled the Magori and its tributaries, a creature that was not worshipped but feared, not revered but appeased. The stories spoke of a beast that controlled the river's flow, that could cause floods or droughts at will, that demanded tribute in the form of livestock left on specific sandbars at specific times of the year. The colonial administrators had dismissed these stories as primitive superstition, but Julian had recognized in them the hallmarks of genuine ecological knowledge, the kind of accumulated wisdom that came from generations of living in proximity to a dangerous predator. He had spent 10 years searching for the Dingonek, and this expedition was the culmination of that search. He had narrowed the creature's probable range to a 50-kilometer stretch of the Magori, a section of the river that was inaccessible by road and rarely visited even by local fishermen, who spoke of it in whispers and avoided it during certain phases of the moon. He had convinced Sarah to join him by appealing to her scientific integrity, by framing the expedition as a search for a relic population of an unknown species rather than a monster hunt. He had hired Zachary because the old man was the only guide willing to venture into the disputed section of the river, and he had accepted Thomas's volunteer application because he needed someone to carry the equipment, and because the graduate student's enthusiasm reminded him of his own younger self. And now, on the 5th day, with the crocodiles gone and the river growing stiller with every kilometer they traveled, Julian knew with a certainty that transcended scientific skepticism, that he was close. "Camp here," he said to Kofi, pointing to a flat stretch of bank where a stand of acacia trees provided some shade from the midday sun. "We'll rest for a few hours, then continue upstream this afternoon." Kofi guided the boat toward the shore, and the porters jumped out to secure the mooring ropes. The bank was muddy, the kind of thick, red-brown clay that was common along the Magori's lower reaches, and it squelched underfoot with a sound that Sarah found oddly comforting after days of being confined to the boat. She stretched her legs, feeling the blood flow back into muscles that had stiffened from inactivity, and she walked a few meters inland to examine the vegetation. That was when she smelled it. The scent was faint at first, a whiff of something organic and wrong that drifted on the sluggish air from somewhere upstream. It was not the smell of decay, not exactly. Decay had a sweetness to it, a cloying richness that the nose recognized as natural even when the mind found it unpleasant. This was different. This was sharp, metallic, like the smell of a butcher's shop on a hot day, like blood that had been exposed to air for too long, like flesh that had been stripped of its skin and left to dry in the sun. "Julian," she called, and her voice was strange, higher than usual, the voice of someone who had just noticed something that should not be there. "What is it?" I think you need to see this." They followed the scent upstream, away from the boat and the relative safety of the open river, into a stagnant bend where the Magori's current slowed to a crawl, and the water pooled in eddies that were thick with water hyacinth and the floating debris of upstream floods. The bend was shaded by a dense canopy of mangrove trees, their roots forming a tangled architecture that extended into the water like the fingers of drowning men. The air was still here, heavy with moisture and the buzz of insects, and the smell was stronger, concentrated, almost solid in its intensity. And then they saw the bodies. There were 7 of them, arranged in a rough semicircle along the bank where the mud was softest and the water was shallowest. They were hippopotamuses, or had been hippopotamuses, massive herbivores that were normally among the most dangerous animals in Africa, responsible for more human deaths than any other mammal on the continent. But these hippos were not dangerous anymore. They were dead, and they had been dead for days, perhaps weeks, and the manner of their death was unlike anything Sarah had seen in 20 years of field biology. The carcasses were not decayed in the normal way. There was no bloating, no rupturing, no cloud of flies and beetles that normally accompany death in the tropics. The bodies looked almost processed. The hides had been stripped from the flesh in precise, surgical strips, as if by a blade wielded with anatomical knowledge, and the underlying musculature was exposed in patterns that suggested not random scavenging but deliberate flaying. The bones were intact, the organs undisturbed, but the skin was gone, peeled away with a care that suggested the perpetrator had known exactly what it was doing. "What the hell?" Thomas whispered, and his voice was the voice of a young man who had just encountered the limits of his education. "Julian," Sarah said, and she was kneeling beside the nearest carcass, her hands moving with the professional detachment of a scientist examining evidence. "Look at the neck." Julian approached, his face pale beneath its tan, and he looked where she was pointing. The hippo's neck, thick, muscular, protected by a layer of fat and hide that could withstand the bite of a lion, bore a single hole, roughly the diameter of a broom handle, that penetrated straight through to the spine. The edges of the wound were clean, not torn but punctured, and there was no sign of the bruising or tissue damage that would have accompanied a bite. "It's not a bite," Sarah said, her voice hushed with the awe of discovery. "It's a puncture, a single clean puncture like a stinger or a spear." "The Dingonek's tail," Julian breathed, and his eyes were shining with a light that Sarah found deeply disturbing. Jordan described it, a heavy stinger at the end of the tail used for stunning prey. He thought it was venomous. "This isn't venom," Sarah said, probing the wound with a stick she had picked up from the bank. "The tissue around the puncture isn't necrotic, it's paralyzed. The muscles are intact but non-functional, like the neurotoxin of a cone snail or a stonefish, something that blocks nerve impulses without destroying tissue." "It paralyses them," Julian said, and he was pacing now, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind racing through implications. "It paralyses them and then it strips their hides," Sarah finished. "While they're still alive, or were still alive, it flays them, Julian. It peels their skin off while they're conscious but unable to move." The horror of it settled over them like a physical weight, a realization so dark that it seemed to dim the sunlight filtering through the mangrove canopy. Whatever had killed these hippos had not hunted them for meat, had not killed them quickly and efficiently the way a predator should. It had incapacitated them, rendered them immobile but aware, and then it had subjected them to a process of flaying that was almost surgical in its precision. The killer had taken their hides and left the rest, the flesh and bone and organs that would have sustained a normal predator. "Why?" Thomas asked, and his voice was small, broken. "Why would anything do that?" "Because it doesn't eat meat," Zachary said, and his voice came from behind them, from the shadows of the mangroves where he had been standing in silence. "Because it eats fear. Because it eats the thing that comes out of the skin when the skin is taken away." They turned to look at him, and Sarah saw that his face had gone gray, the color of old ash, and his hands were trembling at his sides. "Zachary," she said gently, "what do you know about this?" He looked at her, and his eyes held a depth of knowledge that frightened her more than the carcasses did. "My grandfather told me stories," he said. "Stories about the River King, the thing that lives in the deep bends where the water is still and the mud is thick. He said it was old, older than the crocodiles, older than the hippos, older than the people who first came to this river. He said it didn't hunt for food, not in the way that lions hunt for food. It hunted for something else, for the moment when the prey realizes it cannot escape, for the taste of surrender." "That's superstition," Julian said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Zachary gestured at the carcasses. "You are scientists. You tell me what kind of animal kills like this. What kind of predator paralyzes its prey and then strips its skin while it still lives? What kind of creature leaves the meat and takes only the hide?" No one answered him. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the buzz of insects and the distant cry of a fish-eagle, and Sarah felt the first cold thread of real fear begin to unwind in her stomach. She had seen predators hunt. She had watched lions take down buffalo, had observed hyenas strip carcasses to the bone, had documented the feeding behaviors of everything from army ants to Komodo dragons, but she had never seen anything like this. This was not predation. This was something else, something that operated on principles she did not understand, driven by needs that had nothing to do with nutrition or survival. "We should leave," she said quietly. "Julian, we should go back. Whatever did this is still here. It's probably watching us right now." "We can't leave," Julian said, and his voice had taken on the stubborn edge that she knew too well, the tone of a man who had committed too much time, money, reputation, sanity to turn back now. "This is evidence. This is proof. We've found the Dingonek's hunting ground. We're closer than anyone has ever been." "Julian, those hippos were killed days ago. The killer could be miles upstream by now, or it could be in the water right next to us. We don't know. We don't have the equipment to deal with something like this. We don't even know what we're dealing with." "Then we find out." Julian turned to Thomas, his eyes bright with the fever of obsession. "Set up the cameras. I want motion-activated traps along the bank. I want underwater microphones in the shallows. I want every piece of recording equipment we have trained on this bend. If the Dingonek comes back, I want to know about it before it knows about us." Thomas moved to obey, his face pale but his hands steady, and Sarah watched him with a mixture of pity and admiration. The graduate student was too young to understand what he was getting into, too inexperienced to recognize the signs of a predator's territory, too full of the idealism of science to see that some questions were better left unasked. She helped him set up the equipment, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. The cameras were placed at strategic points along the bank, angled to capture the widest possible field of view. The microphones were lowered into the water on weighted cables, their sensitive membranes ready to detect any sound that was not part of the river's normal acoustic signature. They worked in silence, the heat of the afternoon pressing down on them like a hand, and by the time they were finished, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were almost beautiful enough to make Sarah forget what lay in the mud behind them. They returned to the boat as the light was fading, and Julian insisted on staying at the camp rather than retreating downstream to safer ground. "The Dingonek is nocturnal," he said, consulting his photocopied pages from Jordan's journal. "Jordan encountered it at dusk, near a watering hole. If we're going to see it, it'll be after dark." "And if it sees us first?" Sarah asked. "Then we'll have the cameras, we'll have the evidence. That's why we're here, Sarah, not to be safe, to be witnesses." They built a fire on the bank, a small, controlled blaze that Julian kept deliberately low, following Jordan's advice about not attracting attention with bright light. They ate dried rations and drank water that Zachary had purified with tablets, and they sat in a circle around the fire, watching the darkness gather beyond the reach of the flames. The porters, David and Daniel, sat apart from the group, speaking to each other in low voices in a language that Sarah did not understand, their eyes constantly moving toward the river and the mangroves beyond. The night was warm, the kind of African night that wrapped around the body like a damp blanket, and the insects sang with an intensity that suggested they were making up for the silence of the crocodiles. Sarah sat with her back against a tree, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and she listened to the river. It made its usual sounds, the lapping of water against the bank, the splash of fish rising to take insects from the surface, the rustle of reeds in the occasional breeze. But beneath these sounds, she thought she heard something else, something that did not belong. It was a grinding, a low, rhythmic grinding like two heavy stones being rubbed together. It came from upstream, from the direction of the hippo graveyard, and it was accompanied by a sound like water being displaced, not with a splash but with a heavy, deliberate stillness, as if something massive were moving through the shallows without disturbing the surface. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Julian nodded, his face illuminated from below by the fire, his eyes wide and bright. "It's moving," he breathed. "It's coming." "Julian, we need to get to the boat. We need to." "Look." He pointed, and Sarah followed his finger to the river, to the stretch of water between their camp and the opposite bank, and she felt her heart stop. The moon had risen, a pale sliver that cast just enough light to silver the surface of the Magori, and in that silver light something was moving. It was massive, at least 15 feet long, and its back rose from the water like a submarine surfacing, armored and glistening with a sheen that reminded Sarah of wet slate. The scales, if they were scales, caught the moonlight and reflected it in a pattern that suggested not random arrangement but deliberate design, a tessellation of overlapping plates that moved with the creature's body in a way that made them seem almost liquid. It did not splash. It did not churn the water or create waves. It simply displaced the river, pushing the water aside with a terrifying, heavy stillness that suggested the water was yielding not out of physics but out of respect. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, its body gliding through the reeds with a silence that was more disturbing than any roar could have been, and Sarah understood in that moment why the crocodiles had left. They had not been driven out. They had been dismissed. The river had a new king, and the old rulers had bowed their heads and departed rather than challenge a sovereignty that was older than their own. "My God," Julian whispered, and his voice was the voice of a man who had just seen his life's ambition fulfilled and realized, too late, that fulfillment was indistinguishable from terror. "It's real. It's actually real." Sarah reached for his arm, her fingers closing around his wrist with a grip that was meant to convey urgency, to drag him back from the edge of the water before the thing in the river noticed them. "Julian," she hissed. "Julian, we need to move. Now." But he was transfixed, his eyes locked on the armored back that was still visible in the moonlight, his body leaning forward as if he wanted to run toward the creature rather than away from it. "The Dingonek," he breathed. "The River King, it's magnificent." The creature stopped. It was halfway across the river, its body still partially submerged, and it paused as if it had heard something, as if some sensory organ had detected the presence of warm bodies on the bank. The moonlight caught the top of its head, and Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. Two eyes, pale and luminous, that reflected the light not like an animal's eyes but like polished stone, like the surfaces of the river-smoothed pebbles that lined the Magori's bed. For a long moment the creature remained motionless, its body half visible in the silver water, its eyes fixed on the camp with an intensity that suggested not curiosity but calculation. It was studying them, Sarah realized. It was assessing them, weighing them, deciding whether they were worth the effort of pursuit. And in that moment of stillness, she heard the sound again, the grinding of heavy stones, rhythmic and patient, like a millstone turning, like the heartbeat of something that measured time in centuries rather than seconds. Then, without warning, the creature sank. It did not dive. It simply descended, its body lowering into the water with a gentleness that suggested control rather than retreat, and the river closed over it with barely a ripple, leaving only the memory of its passage in the disturbed reeds and the silence that followed. "It knows we're here," Zachary said, and his voice was barely audible above the insects. "It knows, and it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Thomas asked, and his voice was a whisper. "For us to make a mistake," Zachary said. "For us to enter the water, for us to become part of the river." They sat in silence around the dying fire, none of them willing to sleep, none of them willing to speak, and Sarah watched the river with eyes that would not close, waiting for the armored back to rise again, waiting for the grinding sound to resume, waiting for the moment when the River King would decide that the waiting was over and the feeding could begin. The dawn came with a violence that seemed almost personal, the sun rising from the eastern savanna in a blaze of orange and red that painted the Magori's waters the color of blood, and turned the mangrove canopy into a lattice of black silhouettes against the burning sky. Sarah had not slept, had not even closed her eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, and when the first light filtered through the acacia leaves, she felt not refreshed but hollowed out, as if the night had scraped away some essential layer of her being and left only the raw nerves exposed. Julian had slept, or pretended to sleep, his body curled on a ground sheet near the fire's ashes, his face relaxed in a way that suggested either profound exhaustion or a complete dissociation from the reality of their situation. Thomas had kept watch with her for the first few hours, the graduate student sitting with his back against a tree, his eyes fixed on the river with a vigilance that had gradually degraded into a glassy, thousand-yard stare. He had not seen the creature the way she had, not with the clarity of moonlight and the slow, terrible realization of what they were facing. He had seen a shape, a darkness, a suggestion of movement that might have been anything. But Sarah had seen the scales, she had seen the eyes, and she had seen the way the water had yielded to the creature's passage, not because of physics but because of dominion. Zachary had not slept either. He sat apart from the group, his back to the river, his face turned toward the land as if he were contemplating escape routes, calculating distances, measuring the odds of survival against the geography of a terrain he had known since childhood. Sarah watched him in the gray light of early morning, and she saw something in his posture that she had not noticed before. The stiffness of a man who had accepted his own death and was simply waiting for it to arrive. The resignation of someone who had seen this moment coming for years and was relieved that the waiting was finally over. "We need to cross the river," Julian said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent the night dreaming of his obsession and had woken with his determination renewed. "The Dingonek was on this side last night. It's patrolling this bank. If we cross to the other side, we might be able to bypass its territory and reach the highlands." "Cross the river," Sarah repeated, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "Julian, we have one boat. We can't all fit in it at once, and even if we could, the motor would attract every predator for miles." "There's a ford," Zachary said, and his voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man reading from a script he had memorized long ago. 2 kilometers upstream, a shallow crossing where the river splits around a gravel bar. In the dry season, you can wade across without the water reaching your waist. "The dry season ended 3 weeks ago," Sarah said. "The water level has risen." "It has," Zachary agreed. "But the ford is still there. The water is deeper, but it is still possible to cross, if you are willing to risk it." "We have to risk it," Julian said, already packing his equipment with the frantic energy of a man who had decided on a course of action and would not be dissuaded. "The highlands are our only chance. From there, we can signal for help. We can reach the colonial outpost. We can get out of this valley and never come back." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to point out that crossing a river patrolled by a creature they did not understand was not a plan but a gamble, that the ford was exactly the kind of place where an ambush predator would wait, that every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to stay on this side of the Magori, to follow the bank downstream, to retreat toward the outpost they had left 5 days ago. But she looked at Julian's face, at the bright, feverish light in his eyes, and she knew that he was beyond persuasion. The Dingonek was not just a research subject anymore. It was the culmination of his life's work, the validation of 30 years of marginalization and mockery, and he would follow it into hell itself if that was what it took to prove that he had been right all along. They broke camp with the efficiency of people who had learned to prioritize speed over comfort. The porters folded the tents and packed the supplies with practiced movements that suggested they had done this many times before, their dark faces expressionless, their eyes avoiding the river. Thomas helped, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, the aftermath of a sleepless night and the shock of what he had witnessed. Sarah checked her equipment, a small caliber rifle that she had brought for protection against leopards and hyenas, a knife, a first aid kit, a satellite phone that had not found a signal since they entered the valley. The rifle felt inadequate in her hands, a toy weapon that might stop a lion but would be useless against something that wore armor like a tank. They reached the ford at mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the last of the night's mist, and the river lay before them in a sheet of brown water that moved with a deceptive laziness. The ford was exactly as Zachary had described it, a gravel bar that split the Magori into two channels, each roughly 20 meters wide, with the upstream channel appearing shallower and the downstream channel running deeper and faster. The water was murky, thick with sediment from upstream rains, and Sarah could not see the bottom even in the shallows. "I'll go first," Julian said, and he was already stepping into the water, his boots sinking into the soft gravel, his body leaning into the current with the confidence of a man who had crossed many rivers in his life. "Julian, wait," Sarah called, but he was already moving, wading into the upstream channel with a stride that was too bold, too eager, too blind to the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. Sarah followed him, her rifle held above her head with one hand, her other hand reaching for Thomas, who was hesitating at the water's edge, his face pale. "Come on," she said, trying to inject a note of confidence that she did not feel. "Stay close, keep moving, don't stop in the middle." Thomas entered the water behind her, and then came the porters, David and Daniel, moving with the steady rhythm of men who had learned to trust their bodies in difficult terrain. Zachary came last, his eyes scanning the river with a methodical thoroughness that made Sarah want to scream at him to move faster, to stop looking and start running. They were halfway across the upstream channel when Sarah felt it. It was not a sound, not at first. It was a pressure, a change in the water's behavior that her body registered before her mind could process it. The current, which had been steady against her legs, seemed to hesitate, to stall, as if something upstream were blocking the flow. The water level dropped slightly, just an inch or two, and then it rose again, and Sarah felt a cold thread of terror begin to unwind in her stomach. "Move," she said, and her voice was a harsh whisper. "Move now, faster." But it was too late. The attack came not from the water but from the mud, and it came with a speed that was obscene for something so large. The creature had not been wading in the river. It had been buried in the ford itself, concealed beneath a layer of sediment and aquatic vegetation that perfectly matched the color and texture of the riverbed. As Sarah watched in horror, the gravel bar erupted, the surface of the ford splitting open like a wound, and the Dingonek emerged from its hiding place with a violence that sent water spraying in all directions. It was larger than it had appeared in the moonlight, larger than anything Sarah's mind could properly scale. Its body was easily 15 feet long, a massive cylinder of armored flesh that seemed to have been designed by a committee of engineers who had never heard of the laws of physics. The scales, those overlapping, pangolin-like plates that had glistened in the moonlight, were fully visible now, and they were not merely protective but beautiful, a tessellation of slate gray and midnight blue that shifted color as the creature moved, creating patterns that drew the eye and held it, hypnotic and terrible. But the head was the worst part. It was broad and flat, like the head of a crocodile but wider, more massive, with a snout that tapered to a blunt point and jaws that hung slightly open to reveal the walrus fangs that Jordan had described. They were not truly fangs, Sarah saw, not in the dental sense. They were tusks, curved and yellowed and as thick as a man's wrist at the base, protruding downward from the upper jaw in a way that suggested not biting but gripping, not tearing but holding. And beneath the tusks, the mouth itself was a dark cavern lined with rows of small, sharp teeth that were designed not for killing but for processing, for stripping flesh from bone with the efficiency of a surgeon's blade. The creature did not roar. It did not hiss or bellow or make any sound that Sarah could identify as aggressive. It simply moved, its body flowing out of the mud with a fluid grace that was more disturbing than any charge could have been, and its tail, That massive, muscular tail that had been hidden beneath the sediment rose from the water like a scorpion's stinger. The tail was the weapon. Sarah saw it clearly in the fraction of a second before it struck, saw the thick, bulbous tip that was studded with what looked like calcified barbs, saw the way the muscles along its length bunched and flexed in preparation for the blow. It was not a tail designed for swimming, not the flattened paddle of a crocodile or the whip-like appendage of a lizard. It was a club, a mace, a biological sledgehammer that could crush bone and rupture organs with a single impact. It struck David first. The porter had been slightly ahead of the others, his body angled toward the far bank, his attention focused on maintaining his footing on the slippery gravel. He did not see the tail rising behind him, did not hear the rush of displaced water, did not have time to register the shadow that fell across his back before the blow landed. The sound was not what Sarah expected. It was not the wet thud of flesh on flesh, not the crack of breaking bone. It was a thump, a deep, resonant thump like a bass drum struck with a padded mallet, and David's body jerked as if he had been hit by a vehicle. His leg buckled beneath him, not from pain but from paralysis, the neurotoxin entering his system through the puncture wounds left by the tail's barbs, and he collapsed into the water with a sound that was barely audible above the rush of the river. He did not scream. That was the horror of it. The toxin worked too fast for screaming, blocking the nerve impulses that controlled voluntary muscle contraction before the pain signals could reach his brain. David lay in the shallow water, his eyes open and aware, his body completely limp, and Sarah could see the confusion in his face, the desperate attempt to understand why his limbs would not obey his commands, why his mouth would not form words, why he was sinking into the brown water while his mind remained perfectly, terrifyingly conscious. "David!" Daniel shouted, and he lunged toward his brother, his hands reaching for the sinking body. "No!" Sarah screamed. But Daniel was already in motion, and the Dingonek was already turning, its massive body pivoting with a speed that seemed impossible for something so heavy, and its tail rose again. Sarah raised her rifle, her fingers finding the trigger by instinct, and she fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space of the river valley, the report echoing off the banks and sending birds screaming from the trees, and she saw the bullet strike the creature's flank with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. The scale that was hit, a single plate near the creature's shoulder, spat a spark, and the bullet ricocheted away with a whine that was lost in the river's rush, and the Dingonek did not even flinch. "The scales!" Julian shouted, and his voice was wild, triumphant, the voice of a man who had just seen his theories confirmed even as his companion lay paralyzed in the water. "They're impervious. The bullets can't penetrate." "Julian, help me!" Sarah screamed. But Julian was not moving toward David or Daniel. He was standing in the shallows, his camera raised, his finger pressing the shutter with a frantic energy that suggested he was more concerned with capturing the moment than with surviving it. The Dingonek's tail struck Daniel before he could reach his brother, and the second porter joined the first in the water, his body going limp with the same terrifying speed, his eyes wide and aware as the toxin flooded his nervous system. The creature did not follow up with a killing blow. It did not need to. The paralysis was complete, irreversible, and the river would do the rest. The Dingonek simply watched, its pale eyes fixed on the two floating bodies with an expression that suggested not satisfaction but assessment, the cold evaluation of a predator that had learned to incapacitate its prey and let the environment finish the job. "Run!" Zachary shouted, and his voice was the voice of a man who had seen this before, who had known since childhood that the River King hunted in this way. "The shallows! Get to the shallows! It can't move fast in shallow water." Sarah grabbed Thomas's arm and dragged him toward the far bank, her boots slipping on the gravel, her rifle forgotten in her other hand. Julian followed, finally torn from his photographic frenzy by the reality of two men dying in the water behind him, and they scrambled up the bank and onto dry ground with a desperation that made their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. The Dingonek did not pursue them immediately. It remained in the ford, its body partially submerged, its tail resting on the gravel bar like a weapon that had been temporarily set aside. It watched them with its pale eyes, and Sarah could feel its attention like a physical weight, a pressure against her skin that made her want to scratch herself raw just to relieve the sensation. "It's hurting us," she gasped, her chest heaving, her clothes dripping with river water. Look at the way it's positioned." She was right. The creature had placed itself at the exact center of the ford, blocking the crossing but leaving the downstream channel open. It was not attacking because it did not need to attack. It was directing them, channeling them, forcing them to move in the direction it wanted them to go. "The mangroves," Zachary said, and his voice was hollow, the voice of a man who had just realized that his childhood nightmares were coming true. "It's pushing us toward the mangroves." Sarah looked downstream, and she saw what he meant. The mangrove thicket that lined the river's southern bank was dense and impassable, a wall of twisted roots and interlocking branches that extended from the water's edge deep into the interior. It was the kind of terrain where movement was slow and visibility was zero, where the mud was thick enough to swallow a boot, and the roots were treacherous enough to break an ankle. It was a trap, a natural bottleneck that would confine them in a space where the Dingonek's bulk and armor would be overwhelming advantages. "We can't go in there," Thomas said, and his voice was a whine, the voice of a young man who had reached the limit of his courage. "We'll get stuck. We'll drown in the mud." "If we stay here, it will kill us," Sarah said. "If we try to cross the river, it will kill us. The mangroves are our only option. At least there we might be able to hide. We might be able to climb." "It can climb too," Zachary said quietly. "Not well, but it can climb, and it can dig, and it can wait. It has waited for centuries. A few hours more means nothing to it." The Dingonek moved then, not toward them but parallel to the bank, its body sliding through the water with a silence that was more disturbing than any roar. It was circling them, Sarah realized. It was establishing a perimeter, making sure they had nowhere to go except the direction it had chosen. The precision of the movement was terrifying, the geometric exactness of a predator that understood terrain and strategy and the psychology of fear. "Move," Sarah said, and her voice was flat, the voice of someone who had accepted that survival was no longer guaranteed and was now simply trying to delay the inevitable. "Into the mangroves. Stay together. Don't run. If you run, you'll break an ankle, and if you break an ankle, you're dead. Walk. Walk fast, but walk." They entered the mangrove thicket with a reluctance that was almost palpable, their bodies pushing through the curtain of aerial roots, their boots sinking into the black mud that smelled of decay and ancient water. The light changed immediately, the dense canopy filtering the morning sun into a green twilight that made everything look underwater, submerged in a murky aquarium where the rules of terrestrial physics no longer applied. The air was thick with moisture and the buzz of insects, and the sounds of the river faded behind them, replaced by the wet crunch of their footsteps and the occasional splash of something moving in the stagnant pools that gathered between the roots. The Dingonek did not follow them into the thicket. It did not need to. It had herded them into the trap, and now it would wait for them to exhaust themselves, to panic, to make the mistakes that would bring them back to the water's edge where its domain was absolute. Sarah understood this with a clarity that came from years of studying predator behavior, and she understood too that their only hope was to break out of the thicket on the other side, to reach the highlands that Zachary had mentioned, to put enough distance between themselves and the river that the creature would lose interest and return to its patrolling. But the mangroves were deeper than she had realized, thicker, more labyrinthine. They walked for what felt like hours, following game trails that led nowhere, circling back on themselves, becoming more lost with every step. The mud grew deeper, reaching their knees in some places, and the roots formed a tangled architecture that was impossible to navigate without crawling, climbing, fighting for every meter of progress. Thomas broke first. He had been whimpering for the last 30 minutes, a low, constant sound that was almost worse than screaming, and when his boot caught on a submerged root and he pitched forward into the mud, he began to cry in earnest, great heaving sobs that shook his body and sent ripples across the stagnant pools. "I can't," he gasped, his face smeared with black mud, his eyes red and wild. "I can't do this, I can't." "Get up," Sarah said, reaching for his arm. "Thomas, get up, we have to keep moving. It's going to kill us. It's going to kill us all. We're going to die in this mud and no one will ever find us. Get up." She pulled him to his feet, and he stood there swaying, his body covered in mud, his spirit broken. Julian watched them with an expression that Sarah could not read, something between pity and frustration, and Zachary stood apart, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the canopy above them. "It's listening," Zachary said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "It can hear us. It can hear our breathing, our heartbeats. It has ears like a leopard. That's what my grandfather said. Ears that can hear a mouse's heartbeat from 20 meters away." "Then we need to be quiet," Sarah said. "We need to move silently. We need to." "It already knows where we are," Zachary interrupted. "It has always known. From the moment we entered its river, it has known. The question is not whether it will find us. The question is when it will decide we are ready." "Ready for what?" Julian asked, and his voice was strange, distant, the voice of a man who was beginning to understand that his obsession had led him not to discovery but to destruction. "Ready to be taken," Zachary said. "Ready to be stripped, ready to become part of the river's story." They pushed deeper into the mangroves, and the light grew dimmer, and the mud grew deeper, and Sarah felt the first stirrings of a despair that was deeper than any fear she had ever known. She had studied predators. She had respected them, feared them, learned to anticipate their behavior and avoid their territories. But the Dingonek was not a predator in any sense that her training had prepared her for. It was something older, something more patient, something that hunted not for food but for something else entirely. The way it had paralyzed David and Daniel without killing them, the way it had herded them into the mangroves without pursuing them, the way it stripped the hides from hippos while leaving the meat all of it suggested a psychology that was alien, incomprehensible, fundamentally inhuman. "We need a plan," she said, more to break the silence than because she had won. "We can't just keep wandering. We need to find high ground, solid ground, somewhere we can defend." "There is no defending against the River King," Zachary said. "There is only escaping, and escaping is not possible once you have entered its domain." "Then we make it possible," Sarah snapped, her fear translating into anger, her despair into determination. "We use the environment, we use what we have, we find a weakness." "Its armor is impervious," Julian said, and there was a note of something in his voice that sounded almost like satisfaction, the grim pleasure of a scientist whose theories had been confirmed even at the cost of his own life. "The bullets bounced off. Nothing we have can penetrate those scales." "Then we don't try to penetrate them," Sarah said. "We try to avoid them, we try to outsmart it, we use the terrain." "The terrain is its weapon," Zachary said. "The mud, the water, the mangroves, all of it belongs to the Dingonek. We are walking through its body, breathing its air, moving through its veins." "Then we get out of its body," Sarah said, and she was moving again, pushing through the roots, climbing over fallen trunks, forcing her way toward what she hoped was the edge of the thicket. "We find the highlands. We find the ridge. We get out of this valley and back to civilization, and we burn Julian's journals and never speak of this again." Julian flinched at the mention of his journals, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes that might have been doubt, might have been regret, might have been the first crack in the armor of his obsession. But then it was gone, replaced by the same bright, feverish determination that had driven him since they first set foot on the Magori, and he followed her into the green twilight with the single-mindedness of a man who had already decided that his life was a fair price for knowledge. They walked until the light began to fail, until the green twilight of the mangrove canopy gave way to a deeper darkness that suggested evening was approaching. They had found no exit, no game trail that led to the highlands, no solid ground that offered refuge from the mud and the roots and the ever-present awareness of being hunted. They were exhausted, hungry, dehydrated, and Sarah could feel her own judgment beginning to fray, her tactical mind succumbing to the primitive panic that whispered at the edges of her consciousness. And then they heard it. The grinding sound, the sound of heavy stones being rubbed together. It came from behind them, from somewhere in the mangroves they had already passed through, and it was accompanied by a sound like water being displaced, like something massive moving through shallow pools with a heavy, deliberate stillness. "It's coming," Zachary whispered, and his face was the color of old parchment. "It has decided we are ready." "Climb," Sarah said, pointing to a massive mahogany tree that rose above the mangrove canopy like a tower above a forest. "Climb, now." They scrambled for the tree, their mud-slicked hands finding holds in the rough bark, their boots scrabbling for purchase on the lower branches. Thomas was the slowest, his exhausted muscles failing him, and Sarah had to reach down and grab his wrist, hauling him upward with a strength that came from pure adrenaline. Julian climbed with the agility of a man who had spent decades in the field, his wiry frame fitting easily between the branches, and Zachary followed with a grim determination that suggested he knew this was their last chance. They reached a branch 20 feet above the ground, a thick limb that supported all four of them with minimal flexing, and they huddled there in the gathering darkness, their breath coming in gasps, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Below them, the grinding sound grew louder, closer, and Sarah could see movement in the shadows between the mangrove roots, a massive shape that flowed through the thicket with a silence that was more terrifying than any roar. The Dingonek emerged into the small clearing beneath their tree, and for the first time, Sarah saw it fully, completely, in the fading light of day. It was even larger than she had thought, its body stretching 20 feet from snout to tail tip, its armored back rising nearly 4 feet above the ground. The scales were fully extended now, each one lifted slightly from the body to create a serrated profile that would be impossible to grip or climb. The tail, that terrible weapon, dragged behind it through the mud, leaving a trail of disturbed water that glowed faintly in the twilight. And the eyes, those pale, luminous eyes, scanned the canopy with a methodical patience that suggested the creature knew exactly where they were and was simply waiting for them to come down. "It can't climb," Julian said, and his voice was a whisper that barely carried above the sound of their breathing. "It can't reach us. We're safe." "For now," Zachary said, "but it can wait. It can wait longer than we can." They sat in the tree as the darkness deepened, 4 frightened animals huddled on a branch above a predator that was older than their civilization, and Sarah felt the first stirrings of a plan begin to form in her exhausted mind. The creature was patient, yes. It was armored, yes. It was terrifyingly intelligent, yes. But it was also heavy, bulky, adapted to a semi-aquatic environment where its weight was supported by water. On land, in the dense mangroves, its own mass might become a liability. Its own armor might become a trap. She thought of the sinkholes they had passed, the deep pools of anaerobic mud that had swallowed her boots to the knee. She thought of the creature's weight, its 15-foot body, its massive armor. She thought of the way it had herded them, controlled them, manipulated them into the terrain that suited its needs. And she began to understand that the only way to survive was to turn the predator's own strength against it, to lure it into a place where its power became its prison. "I have an idea," she whispered, and even as she spoke, she knew that the idea was desperate, that it relied on assumptions that might not be true, that it had almost no chance of success. but it was better than waiting in a tree for the Dingonek to decide that the hunt was over. She told them her plan, and in the darkness above the mangrove swamp, with the grinding sound of the River King echoing through the roots below, they prepared to fight back. The night descended on the mangrove swamp with a heaviness that felt almost intentional, as if the darkness itself were a weapon being deployed by the creature that waited below. Sarah sat on the branch, her back pressed against the mahogany trunk, her legs wrapped around the limb with a grip that had become painful hours ago, but that she dared not relax. The Dingonek had not moved from its position beneath the tree, its armored body lying in the shallow water like a submerged log, its pale eyes reflecting the first stars that appeared through gaps in the canopy. It was waiting. That was the horror of it, the patience, the absolute confidence that its prey would eventually descend, would eventually make the mistake that brought them back within reach of its tail. Sarah had told them her plan in whispers so quiet they were barely audible above the insects, and the others had listened with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to blank resignation. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. They would create a series of loud, metallic distractions using the remaining equipment, lure the Dingonek away from the tree, and toward one of the deep sinkholes they had passed during their blind wandering. And then they would run, not toward the river, where the creature's advantage was absolute, but toward the highlands, toward the ridge that Zachary insisted was no more than 2 kilometers to the south. The problem was the bait. Someone had to remain in the tree long enough to throw the distractions, to draw the creature's attention, to make it move in the direction of the sinkhole. And whoever remained would be alone, exposed, with no guarantee that the creature would follow the lure rather than simply wait for the bait to fall. "I'll do it," Julian had said, and Sarah had looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise with suspicion. "I have the tranquilizer gun. If the creature gets too close, I can try to slow it down." "The tranquilizer gun won't work," Sarah said. "The darts won't penetrate those scales." "Maybe not, but it's better than nothing. And I'm the reason we're here. I'm the one who led us into this. I should be the one to get us out." She had agreed, not because she trusted his judgment. She had not trusted Julian's judgment since the moment they set foot on the Magori, but because there was no better option. Thomas was too frightened to be reliable, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely hold his own equipment. Zachary was too fatalistic, too convinced that their deaths were inevitable to be an effective participant in any plan that required hope. And Sarah herself needed to lead the escape, to navigate the mangroves in the darkness, to find the path to the highlands that might not exist. They had divided the equipment. Julian kept the tranquilizer gun, a heavy-barreled pistol that fired darts filled with a potent horse tranquilizer, and a metal cooking pot that they had used to heat their rations. Sarah took a machete, a coil of nylon rope, and the satellite phone, though she knew the chances of getting a signal in the mangrove canopy were virtually zero. Thomas carried the remaining food and water, a small pack that would not slow him down. Zachary carried nothing but his knowledge of the terrain, which was the most valuable asset they possessed. They waited until the moon was high enough to cast a faint, silver light through the canopy, turning the mangrove swamp into a landscape of black and gray that was barely navigable but better than absolute darkness. The Dingonek had not moved, but its eyes were closed now, or seemed to be closed. Sarah could not tell if the creature slept or merely rested, if its metabolism allowed for true unconsciousness or only a state of lowered awareness. It did not matter. They had to move, and they had to move now before the creature's patience outlasted their own. "Go," Julian whispered, and his voice was the voice of a man who had made peace with his own death. "I'll give you 5 minutes, then I'll start the distraction. Head south-southeast. The ridge is that direction. If you hear the pot banging, you'll know it's working. If you hear." "If we hear nothing," Sarah finished for him, "we keep running." "Yes." They climbed down from the tree on the side opposite the creature, their movements slow and careful, their hands finding holds in the bark that they had memorized during the long hours of waiting. The Dingonek did not stir. Its body remained motionless in the shallow water, its breathing, if it breathed, too subtle to detect. Sarah lowered herself to the lowest branch, then dropped the final 6 feet to the mud, landing with a soft thump that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Thomas followed, his landing less controlled, a small splash that sent ripples across the stagnant pool. Zachary came last, his descent silent, his bare feet finding purchase on the mud with a grace that suggested he had done this before, in another life, in another story. They moved through the mangroves with a speed that was reckless but necessary, no longer caring about noise, no longer trying to be stealthy. The only thing that mattered was distance, the meters and kilometers that separated them from the creature beneath the tree. Sarah led, the machete clearing a path through the aerial roots, her ears straining for the sound of Julian's distraction. Behind her, Thomas stumbled and gasped, his body pushed beyond its limits by fear and exhaustion, and Zachary followed with the steady, ground-eating stride of a man who had learned to walk long distances in difficult terrain. 5 minutes passed. 10. Sarah was beginning to think that Julian had changed his mind, that he had frozen in terror, that the plan had failed before it had even begun, and then she heard it. The sound of metal striking metal, a rhythmic banging that echoed through the mangroves like the tolling of a bell. Julian had started the distraction. The cooking pot struck against a branch or a rock, producing a sound that was loud and sharp and utterly artificial, a sound that did not belong in the swamp and would therefore attract the attention of anything that was listening. And the Dingonek was listening. Sarah could feel it, a shift in the atmosphere behind them, a pressure against her back that suggested the creature was moving, orienting on the sound, flowing through the water with the same heavy stillness that it had shown in the river. The banging continued, erratic and desperate, and beneath it she thought she heard Julian's voice, shouting something that might have been a challenge or might have been a prayer. "Keep moving," she gasped to Thomas, who had stopped to listen, his face turned back toward the sound. "Don't stop, don't look back." They ran, and the mangroves seemed to close around them, the roots forming barriers that had to be climbed, the mud sucking at their boots with renewed greed. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs ached, her mind screamed at her to stop, to rest, to collapse in the mud and let the darkness take her. But she kept moving, because stopping meant death, and death meant becoming another exhibit in the Dingonek's collection, another body stripped of its hide and left to rot in the anaerobic mud. The banging stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been, a void of noise that suggested the distraction had ended, that Julian was no longer able to continue, that the creature had reached the tree and found its bait. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and she fell to her knees in the mud, her hands sinking into the black silt, her mind racing through scenarios that all ended in the same way. "What happened?" Thomas whispered, and his voice was the voice of a man who already knew the answer. "He ran out of time," Zachary said quietly, "or the creature ran out of patience." "We have to go back," Thomas said, and he was already turning, his body orienting toward the direction they had come. "We can't just leave him." "If we go back, we die," Sarah said, hauling herself to her feet with a strength that she did not know she possessed. "Julian knew the risk. He made his choice. Our choice is to keep moving." "But move." She grabbed Thomas's arm and dragged him forward, and they ran again, deeper into the mangroves, toward the ridge that might not exist, toward the highlands that might not offer safety, toward any destination that was not the tree where Julian Vane had made his last stand. Behind them, from somewhere in the darkness, came a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. The grinding of heavy stones, rhythmic and patient, moving in their direction with a speed that was faster than it should have been. "It's coming," Zachary said, and there was no surprise in his voice, only the weary acceptance of a man who had known all along that the River King would not be fooled for long. It finished with Julian, and now it's coming for us. How fast? Sarah gasped, her legs pumping, her boots slipping in the mud. Faster than us. In the water, in the mud, it moves like the river itself, but on high ground, on solid rock, it is slow. We must reach the ridge. The ridge is still a kilometer away. Then we must run faster. They burst through a curtain of mangrove roots into a small clearing, a space where a fallen tree had created a gap in the canopy, and for a moment the moonlight reached them, silvering their mud-streaked faces and showing them the path ahead. It was worse than Sarah had feared. The mangroves did not thin out gradually toward the edge of the swamp. They ended abruptly at a wall of dense undergrowth that marked the transition to the highland forest. Between them and that wall lay a stretch of open mud, 50 meters of black, gleaming silt that offered no cover, no roots to climb, no branches to grasp. It was a killing ground, a place where the Dingonek's bulk and armor would be overwhelming advantages. "We have to go around," Thomas said, his voice rising toward panic. "There's no time," Sarah said. "It'll catch us before we find another path. We go straight across. We run as fast as we can and we don't stop." They entered the mud field with a desperation that bordered on madness, their boots sinking to the ankles in the soft silt, their legs pumping with a rhythm that was more flailing than running. The mud was thick, viscous, almost liquid in its consistency, and every step was an effort that sent pain shooting through Sarah's hips and knees. She could hear Thomas behind her, gasping and sobbing, and Zachary's steady breathing, and behind all of it, the grinding sound was getting closer, closer, until she could feel the vibration of it in the mud beneath her feet. They were halfway across when Thomas fell. His boot caught on something submerged in the mud, a root, a rock, the body of some animal that had died here before them, and he pitched forward with a cry that was swallowed by the swamp. He landed face first in the silt, his arms flailing, his pack flying from his shoulders and disappearing into the mud with a wet plop. Sarah turned, her hand reaching for him, and she saw what was emerging from the mangroves behind them. The Dingonek had found them. It flowed out of the tree line with a silence that was obscene for something so large, its armored body sliding across the mud with a fluid grace that suggested the silt was not an obstacle but a lubricant. The scales caught the moonlight and scattered it in 1,000 directions, creating a halo of silver and blue that made the creature look like some divine visitation, some angel of death sent to claim the souls of those who had trespassed in its domain. The tusks, those massive curved fangs that protruded from its jaws, gleamed with a yellowed luster that suggested age beyond counting, and the tail rose behind it like the arm of a god, the bulbous tip already flexing, already preparing to strike. "Thomas!" Sarah screamed, but the graduate student was struggling to rise, his hands slipping in the mud, his body sinking deeper with every attempt to push himself upright. He was trapped, immobilized by the same silt that was allowing the creature to move with such terrifying speed. Sarah did not think. She acted. She grabbed the machete from her belt and ran back toward Thomas, her boots sinking to the knees in the mud, her muscles screaming with the effort. She reached him as the Dingonek closed to within 10 meters, its pale eyes fixed on them with an intensity that suggested not hunger but purpose, not predation but ceremony. "Get up," she shouted, pulling at his arm, trying to drag him free of the mud that held him like a vice. "Thomas, get up." "I can't," he gasped, and his face was a mask of terror and resignation. "I can't move. Sarah, it's going to kill me." "Not if I can help it." She raised the machete, not in any real hope of harming the creature, but in the desperate need to do something, anything, to delay the inevitable. The Dingonek paused, its body coiling in the mud, its head swaying from side to side as if assessing this new development, this tiny mammal that had stopped running and was now trying to fight. Sarah could see the individual scales now, could see the way they overlapped like shingles on a roof, could see the tiny imperfections and scars that suggested this armor had been tested many times before and had never failed. "Sarah," Zachary's voice came from behind her, calm and distant. "The sinkhole to your left." She turned her head and she saw it. A depression in the mud, roughly circular, perhaps 3 meters across, where the silt had given way to something deeper. It was not a true sinkhole, not the kind of geological feature that swallowed houses and cars, but it was deep enough, soft enough, a pocket of anaerobic mud that might be thick enough to trap even the Dingonek's massive bulk. "I can't reach it," she said. "I'm stuck." "You don't need to reach it," Zachary said, and she heard him moving behind her, heard the sound of metal on metal. "You need to make the creature reach it." He was holding something, she saw, the cooking pot that Julian had used for the distraction, the metal pot that was their only remaining piece of equipment. He was striking it with a rock, producing a sharp, rhythmic clang that echoed across the mud field with a clarity that was almost painful. "Hey," Zachary shouted, and his voice was different now, not the quiet resignation of the fatalist but the fierce challenge of a warrior facing his ancestral enemy. "Hey, River King, over here." The Dingonek turned. Its head swung away from Sarah and Thomas, orienting on Zachary with a speed that suggested the old man's challenge had triggered something deep in the creature's neurology, some ancient response to defiance that transcended the usual patience of its hunting style. The pale eyes fixed on Zachary, and the tail rose higher, the bulbous tip quivering with anticipation. "Run, Sarah," Zachary said, and his voice was calm, almost conversational. "Take the boy and run. I'll keep it here." "Zachary, no." "Run." She pulled Thomas to his feet, using every ounce of strength she possessed, and she half-dragged, half-carried him toward the edge of the mud field, toward the undergrowth that marked the beginning of the highland forest. Behind her, she heard the sound of Zachary's pot banging, heard his voice raised in a chant that was not English or Swahili but something older, something that had been passed down through generations of people who had lived with the River King and learned to appease it with words rather than weapons. And then she heard the thump. The sound of the tail striking flesh, the same deep, resonant bass drum sound that had felled David and Daniel in the ford. She heard Zachary's voice cut off mid-chant, heard a splash as his body hit the mud, heard the silence that followed. She did not look back. She could not look back. She dragged Thomas through the undergrowth, thorns tearing at her clothes and skin, branches whipping across her face, and she ran with a single-minded desperation that bordered on madness. The ridge was close now. She could feel it in the slope of the ground, the way the earth rose beneath her feet, the way the vegetation changed from mangrove to hardwood, from swamp to forest. Behind them, the grinding sound resumed. The Dingonek was following. It had dispatched Zachary as it had dispatched the others. A single blow from the tail, a quick injection of neurotoxin, the prey left paralyzed but conscious in the mud, and now it was resuming the hunt. Sarah could hear it moving through the undergrowth, hear the armor scraping against branches, hear the wet, rhythmic slurp of its body dragging itself across the ground. It was slower on land, as Zachary had said, but it was not slow enough. It was gaining on them, meter by meter, its patience inexhaustible, its hunger, if hunger was what drove it, undiminished. They reached the base of the ridge, a steep slope of loose rock and scrub vegetation that rose toward a skyline that was just beginning to lighten with the first gray of false dawn. Sarah did not hesitate. She pushed Thomas toward the slope and began to climb, her fingers finding holds in the rock, her boots scrabbling for purchase on the loose scree. Thomas followed, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his body operating on reserves that were nearly depleted. The Dingonek reached the base of the ridge and stopped. Sarah was 20 meters up when she risked a look back, and she saw the creature at the bottom of the slope, its armored body pressed against the loose rock, its pale eyes fixed on her with an expression that might have been frustration or might have been calculation. The slope was too steep for it, the scree too unstable to support its massive weight. It could not climb, not here, not without risking a slide that would send it tumbling back to the bottom. But it did not leave. It simply waited, its body coiled at the base of the ridge, its tail resting on the ground like a weapon that had been temporarily set aside. It was waiting for them to come down, Sarah realized. It was patient enough to wait for days, for weeks, for as long as it took for them to either descend or die of thirst on the ridge above. "Keep climbing," she gasped to Thomas. "Don't stop." They climbed for an hour, maybe two, their bodies pushed beyond any reasonable limit, their minds blanked of everything except the need to put more distance between themselves and the creature below. The ridge rose and fell, following the topography of the highlands, and Sarah searched for a path that would lead them away from the river, away from the mangroves, away from the domain of the thing that had claimed the Magori for its own. And then, impossibly, miraculously, she saw it. A light in the distance, faint and flickering, but unmistakably artificial. A light that could only come from a human settlement, from the colonial outpost that marked the edge of the mapped world. "There," she said, pointing, her voice a rasp that barely carried above the wind. "Thomas, look, the outpost." He looked and she saw something flicker across his face. Hope, disbelief, the desperate fear that the light might be a hallucination, a mirage created by exhaustion and terror. But it did not fade. It grew stronger as they approached, resolving into the warm glow of a lantern, then two lanterns, then the outline of a building that was crude and weathered but undeniably human. They stumbled into the outpost at dawn, their bodies covered in mud and blood and the residue of the swamp, their faces hollow with exhaustion and shock. The outpost was manned by a single district officer, a tired Kenyan man who had been expecting nothing more exciting than a routine patrol report, and he stared at them with an expression that moved rapidly from confusion to alarm to something that might have been pity. "Please," Sarah gasped, and the word came out as a croak, her throat scraped raw by dehydration and screaming. "Please help us." The officer helped them inside, gave them water and food and blankets, and he listened to their story with a face that grew progressively grayer as they spoke. When they finished, when they had told him about the Dingonek and the ford and the mangroves and the ridge, he sat in silence for a long moment, his hands folded on his desk, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window. "Dr. Vane," he said eventually, "and the others, the porters, the guide." "Dead," Sarah said, and the word felt like a stone in her mouth, heavy and immovable. "Or worse than dead, paralyzed, left in the mud." "I will send a patrol," the officer said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Sarah knew, they both knew, that no patrol would find anything. The Dingonek would have moved its prizes by now, dragged them into the deep water or buried them in the anaerobic mud where they would be preserved until the creature decided to strip their hides. The patrol would find the boat, perhaps. The camp, maybe. But they would not find bodies, because the River King did not leave bodies where they could be found. They stayed at the outpost for 3 days, recovering their strength, waiting for a vehicle that could take them back to Nairobi. Sarah spent most of that time in a cot in the corner of the officers' quarters, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the outpost, the generator's hum, the radio's static, the occasional vehicle passing on the distant road, and trying to process what had happened. Thomas sat with her sometimes, but they did not speak. There was nothing to say that could bridge the gap between the people they had been 5 days ago and the people they were now. On the 3rd day, the officer brought her a package that had been recovered from the boat. Julian's journals, the leather-bound notebooks that contained 30 years of his research, his theories, his maps, his carefully compiled evidence for the existence of the Dingonek. Sarah held them in her hands, feeling the weight of them, the accumulated obsession that had led 5 people into the mangrove swamp and brought only 2 back out. She took the journals outside, to the small fire pit behind the outpost where the officer burned his trash, and she held them over the flames. The leather covers blistered and blackened, the pages curled and flaked, and the handwriting, Julian's precise, obsessive script, vanished into smoke and ash. Thomas found her there, standing over the fire, watching the last of the journals consume itself. "What are you doing?" he asked, and his voice was hollow, the voice of a man who had not yet begun to process his grief. "What he should have done years ago," Sarah said. "What we all should have done before we ever set foot on that river. But his research, his life's work, was wrong," Sarah said, and the words came out with a force that surprised her. "Not the facts were real, the creature is real, but the reason he pursued it, the reason any of us pursued it, that was wrong. We thought we could understand it. We thought we could study it, classify it, fit it into our neat categories of predator and prey, of natural and supernatural. We thought that if we could just see it, just document it, we could control it." She turned to face Thomas, and her eyes were dry, her face composed, but her voice shook with an emotion that was deeper than sadness. "We can't control it, we can't understand it, we can't even survive it except by luck and the sacrifice of people who were smarter than us. Julian died because he thought knowledge was worth any price. David and Daniel died because they needed the money. Zachary died because his grandfather's stories were true, and we survived because we ran, because we were willing to leave them behind. That's not courage, Thomas. That's cowardice, and it's the only reason we're alive." Thomas stared at her, and she saw the reflection of the fire in his eyes, the dancing flames that consumed the last of Julian's notebooks. "Some things are extinct for a reason," Sarah said quietly, turning back to the fire. "Not because the environment killed them, but because they were too dangerous to coexist with anything else. The Dingonek didn't survive because it was fit. It survived because it was terrible. Because anything that could have competed with it was either destroyed or driven away. The crocodiles knew. They left. They abandoned a river that had been their home for millions of years because they recognized something that was worse than they were." "The silence of the crocodiles," Thomas whispered. "Yes." Sarah watched the final pages curl into ash, and she thought about the river, about the way the water had yielded to the creature's passage, about the way the scales had caught the moonlight and scattered it into patterns that suggested not biology but art. That was the only warning we ever truly needed. The silence. The absence of everything that should have been there. If we had been smart, if we had been wise, we would have turned back the moment we noticed the crocodiles were gone. But we weren't wise. We were curious. And curiosity is just another word for the hubris that thinks it can look at terrible things and survive. The fire died down, the last of the journals reduced to gray ash that drifted upward on the morning air, and Sarah stood alone in the African dawn, listening to the sounds of the outpost waking up around her. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, a fish-eagle perhaps, or a hornbill, and the sound was normal, natural, blessedly free of the grinding of heavy stones. But she knew, as she would know for the rest of her life, that the silence was temporary. The crocodiles had left because the river had been claimed, and claims were not surrendered. The Dingonek was still there, in the deep bends where the water was still and the mud was thick, waiting for the next group of curious humans who would ignore the warnings and venture into its domain. And when they came, when some future researcher found Julian's ashes and reconstructed his theories, when some future expedition followed the same river and heard the same silence, the creature would be waiting. It had always been waiting. It would wait until the continents shifted and the rivers changed course and the last human being vanished from the earth, and even then it would continue its patient, terrible existence, the river king of a world that had never belonged to humans and never would. Sarah walked back to the outpost, her feet heavy with the mud she could not wash away, her soul heavy with the knowledge she could not unlearn. The vehicle would come today or tomorrow, and it would carry her back to Nairobi, back to civilization, back to a world where monsters were supposed to be metaphors and rivers were supposed to be safe. But she would never again hear the sound of water lapping against a shore without listening for the grinding of stones beneath it. She would never again see a crocodile basking on a sandbar without wondering what had driven it from its home. And she would never, ever, Forget that the most terrible monsters were not the ones that roared or charged or attacked with visible fury, but the ones that waited in silence, that moved with heavy stillness, that claimed the world piece by piece until there was nothing left but the absence of everything that had once lived. The silence of the crocodiles, the only warning, the only truth, the only memorial to the dead that the river would ever allow. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the morning, and in the spaces between the bird calls and the generator's hum, she thought she could hear it still. The grinding of heavy stones, patient and eternal, waiting for the next curious soul who would mistake it for the sound of the earth itself. The Gilded Throat. The platter was silver, antique, heavy with the weight of centuries, its surface tarnished to a patina that suggested it had been buried, or hidden, or preserved in some environment that had protected it from the corrosive effects of air and moisture, and the relentless passage of time that transformed all metal into rust, and all stone into dust, and all human ambition into the silence of the grave. On the platter lay a single human finger, perfectly preserved, perfectly dressed, the nail trimmed and polished to a gloss that reflected the candlelight in the chamber with a luminosity that was beautiful and obscene in equal measure. The beauty of craftsmanship applied to something that should not have been crafted, the obscenity of artistry devoted to something that should have been buried, mourned, forgotten. The finger was arranged on a bed of gold leaf, the thin sheets crinkling beneath it like the wrapping of a gift, and around the finger were garnishes of herbs that had been dried and preserved with a skill that suggested not merely culinary expertise, but rather surgical precision, the knowledge of anatomy and chemistry, and the properties of organic matter that allowed certain substances to maintain their form and color long after they should have decayed. A voice spoke from the darkness beyond the candlelight, a voice that was not loud but was nonetheless present, audible, intimate in a way that suggested the speaker was standing directly behind the listener, even though there was no one visible in the chamber except the finger and the platter and the shadows that moved with purposes of their own in the flickering illumination. "He isn't hungry for the meat anymore," the voice whispered, and the words seemed to hang in the air like motes of dust, visible only in the candlelight and disappearing when the flame guttered. "He's hungry for the fear. And the fear is what seasons the meat, what preserves it, what transforms it from mere flesh into something that satisfies the appetite of a god." "Doctor." Helena Vance stood in the darkness and stared at the finger, and listened to the voice, and felt her understanding of the world tilt on its axis, because the finger was not merely a trophy or a message or a warning, but was rather a menu item, a course in a meal that had been planned and prepared and presented with an aesthetic sensibility that transcended the primitive hunger of beasts and approached the refined appetite of something that had evolved beyond mere consumption into the realm of gastronomy, into the world of flavor profiles and presentation, and the particular pleasure that came from eating something that had been frightened before it died, something that had experienced the full spectrum of terror and despair and hopelessness, before the final moment when the teeth closed, and the throat swallowed, and the meal was complete. 3 days earlier, or perhaps it was 3 weeks, time had become as unreliable in the labyrinth as space had become, stretching and compressing in ways that had nothing to do with clocks or calendars, or the movement of the sun across the sky. Helena had stood in the ruins of Knossos and looked down at the entrance to the sub-labyrinth, with the expression of professional skepticism that had served her through a career of debunking myths and exposing frauds, and demonstrating that the monsters of legend were merely the projections of human fear onto natural phenomena that could be explained by geology and archaeology and the rational application of scientific methodology. She was a structural engineer by training, a specialist in ancient construction techniques, a woman who had spent decades studying the methods by which civilizations that lacked modern technology had managed to build structures that still stood after millennia of earthquakes and erosion, and the slow decay of the materials from which they had been fashioned. She had been hired for this expedition, not because she believed in the Minotaur, not because she thought there was any truth to the legends of a half-man, half-bull creature that lurked in the maze beneath the palace of Knossos, but because the financiers who were funding the expedition needed someone who could ensure that the newly discovered passages were safe to enter, that the ceilings would not collapse, that the floors would not give way, that the ancient mechanisms that had been uncovered by the recent earthquake would not trigger some catastrophic failure that would bury the team alive in the depths of the Cretan bedrock. The financiers were three wealthy men who had made their fortunes in shipping and oil, and the kind of speculative investments that turned millions into billions, and then back into millions again. Men who believed that the sub-labyrinth contained lost art, ancient treasures, sculptures and frescoes and pottery that would be worth more than their weight in gold on the black market of antiquities that flourished in the shadowy intersection of archaeology and commerce. They had hired Helena to ensure that they did not get lost, that they did not get killed, that they did not become another statistic in the long history of expeditions that had vanished into the earth without a trace, swallowed by the very structures they had come to explore. The team was 6 people, a small group by the standards of modern archaeology, but a large group by the standards of clandestine treasure hunting, and each member had been selected for a specific expertise that complemented the others, creating a unit that was supposed to be capable of handling any challenge that the labyrinth might throw at them. There was Helena, the structural engineer, whose knowledge of ancient building techniques was supposed to keep them alive in the unstable passages. There was Dr. Julian Cross, a linguist and classical scholar, whose expertise in Minoan and Mycenaean scripts was supposed to allow them to read the inscriptions that lined the walls, to understand the warnings and the instructions and the historical records that would guide them through the maze. There was Sergeant Malcolm Reed, a combat veteran who had served in theaters that were not officially acknowledged by any government, whose weapons and training were supposed to protect them from the human threats that might emerge in a region where disputed borders and ancient grievances created a volatile security environment. And there were the 3 financiers themselves, men who had insisted on joining the expedition despite having no relevant skills, who had been told by Helena that they would be liabilities in the tight spaces and unstable conditions of the sub-labyrinth, but who had overridden her objections with the simple fact of their money, their power, their belief that wealth entitled them to witness firsthand the discoveries that their investments were making possible. They were Marcus Whitfield, a rail-thin man with the nervous energy of a gambler who was always one roll away from ruin; Thomas Barrington, a heavy-set man with the red face and swollen nose of someone who drank too much and slept too little; and Richard Cole, a tall, elegant man with silver hair and the cold eyes of a predator who had learned to disguise his appetites behind the mask of civilized charm. The entrance to the sub-labyrinth had been discovered by a team of Greek archaeologists who had been conducting a routine survey of the earthquake damage to the main palace complex, and they had found a staircase that descended into the bedrock at an angle that was too steep and too regular to be natural, a staircase that had been carved by human hands and concealed by a slab of limestone that had been dislodged by the seismic activity. The Greek team had descended approximately 50 meters before turning back, frightened by the shifting geometry of the passages, by the way the walls seemed to move when they were not looking directly at them, by the inscriptions that spoke of a living machine that was designed not merely to confuse but to consume, not merely to contain but to digest. They had reported their findings to the authorities, and the authorities had classified the site as too dangerous for further exploration, and the financiers had learned of the classification through their network of contacts, and had assembled this team of experts and non-experts to enter the site before the government could seal it permanently, to recover the art that waited in the depths before the bureaucracy could claim it for the public domain. Helena had accepted the assignment because the fee was substantial, because the challenge was intriguing, because the opportunity to study a previously unknown extension of the Knossos complex was too rare to pass up, and because she had not believed the Greek team's reports of moving walls and shifting geometry, had dismissed their fears as the product of stress and claustrophobia, and the suggestive power of ancient inscriptions that spoke of monsters and mazes, and the eternal hunger of something that waited in the dark. They descended on a Tuesday morning, or at least Helena thought it was Tuesday, because the days had begun to blur together even before they entered the labyrinth. The preparations and the briefings, and the endless negotiations, with the financiers creating a fog of activity that made temporal markers irrelevant. That reduced the passage of time to a continuous present of anticipation and anxiety, and the slowly mounting certainty that they were making a mistake, that they were entering something that should not be entered, that they were violating a boundary that had been established for reasons that went beyond mere safety and approached the realm of the sacred, the forbidden, the absolutely prohibited. They entered through the staircase that the Greek team had discovered, Helena in the lead with her hard hat and her flashlight and her portable laser measuring device that would allow her to map the passages as they went, creating a digital record of the labyrinth that would guide them back to the surface when the exploration was complete. Julian followed behind her, his eyes scanning the walls for inscriptions, his notebook ready to record any symbols or signs that might provide context for the structure they were entering. Reed came third, his weapon holstered at his hip but his hand never far from the grip, his eyes tracking the shadows and the corners and the places where ambush might be possible, where threat might emerge, where the human enemies he had been hired to protect against might be waiting. And the financiers came last, Marcus and Thomas and Richard, their expensive outdoor gear immaculate, their expensive equipment heavy on their backs, their expensive faces illuminated by the beams of their flashlights as they descended into a darkness that had not been disturbed by human presence in millennia, perhaps longer, perhaps ever. The first 100 meters of the descent were unremarkable, the passage straight and wide and solidly constructed, the walls lined with a plaster that had been painted with frescoes that were remarkably well preserved, scenes of bull leaping and processions, and the kind of maritime imagery that was characteristic of Minoan art. The colors still vivid after thousands of years in the darkness, the blues and reds and golds glowing in the flashlight beams with a luminosity that suggested they had been waiting for this moment, waiting for human eyes to see them again, waiting for the light to return and bring with it the life and the color and the meaning that darkness had stolen from them. The financiers oohed and awed, their voices echoing in the passage with a reverberation that suggested the space was larger than it appeared, that the walls were further apart than the eye could measure, that the geometry of the labyrinth was already playing tricks on their perception, already beginning the process of disorientation that was its primary function, its essential purpose, its reason for existence. "These frescoes are priceless," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with the greed that was his primary motivation, his primary identity, his primary mode of engagement with the world. "If we can remove them intact, if we can transport them to the surface, if we can get them out of Greece and into a private collection, they're worth more than everything I've made in the past decade." "We're not here to loot," Helena said. And her voice was sharp, professional, the voice of a woman who had spent her career fighting against the destruction of archaeological sites by treasure hunters and black market dealers, and the kind of people who saw ancient artifacts as investments rather than as windows into the past. "We're here to document, to study, to understand. The frescoes stay where they are until the proper authorities can be notified and the proper procedures can be followed." But even as she spoke, she knew that the financiers had no intention of following proper procedures, that their entire purpose in funding this expedition was to bypass the authorities, to evade the regulations, to extract the valuable artifacts before anyone could stop them, and that her role as the structural engineer was merely a cover, a disguise, a way of lending legitimacy to an operation that was fundamentally illegitimate, fundamentally criminal, fundamentally wrong. They continued to descend, and the passage began to change, the straight lines becoming curves, the right angles becoming obtuse, the flat floors becoming inclines that sloped downward at angles that made the inner ear protest and the sense of balance waver. Helena measured the angles with her laser device and frowned at the readings, because they did not match the architecture of Knossos, did not conform to the known principles of Minoan construction, did not make sense in terms of the engineering knowledge that had been available to the builders of the palace complex. "The walls are shifting," she said, and her voice was puzzled rather than frightened, because she had not yet understood the implications of what she was seeing, had not yet realized that the labyrinth was not merely a maze of walls but was rather a mechanism, a machine, a living system that responded to their presence, reacted to their movements, adapted to their behavior in ways that no static structure could possibly do. "The angles are changing, the distances are changing, the geometry is not consistent with any known form of architecture." "It's an optical illusion," Richard said, and his voice was confident, dismissive, the voice of a man who had never encountered a problem that his money could not solve, a challenge that his power could not overcome, an obstacle that his will could not remove. "The darkness, the flashlights, the confined space, they're playing tricks on our eyes, making us think the walls are moving when they're really standing still. Trust the measurements, trust the instruments, trust the science." But Helena did trust the instruments, and the instruments were telling her something that should have been impossible, something that violated the laws of physics and the principles of engineering and the very concept of solid matter. And she looked at her laser device and saw that the readings were changing even as she watched, that the walls that had been 3 meters apart were now 2 meters apart, that the ceiling that had been 4 meters high was now 3 meters high, that the passage that had been straight was now curved, and that all of these changes were happening gradually, subtly, in ways that the eye could not detect but the instrument could measure, in ways that suggested the labyrinth was not merely a structure, but was rather an organism, a creature, something that was alive and aware and very interested in the 6 human beings who were walking through its digestive tract. Julian stopped at a junction where 3 passages met, and he pointed his flashlight at the walls and let out a low whistle that was the sound of someone who had just found something extraordinary, something unprecedented, something that would make his career and justify his presence on this expedition, and perhaps even redeem the compromises he had made in agreeing to work for men who were more interested in profit than in knowledge. "The inscriptions," he said, and his voice was trembling with excitement, with awe, with the particular fervor of a scholar who had just encountered the primary source he had been seeking his entire life. "They're not Minoan, they're not Mycenaean, they're not any script that I've ever seen before. And yet they're readable, they're legible, they're speaking to me in a language that I somehow understand even though I've never studied it, never encountered it, never even heard of its existence." Helena moved to his side and shone her flashlight on the wall, and she saw the symbols that Julian had described, not the linear patterns of Minoan hieroglyphs or the angular characters of Mycenaean Greek, but rather something else, something that combined elements of both and transcended both, something that seemed to shift and change even as she looked at it, the symbols rearranging themselves into new configurations that suggested meanings she could almost grasp, almost understand, almost articulate before they slipped away into the darkness of incomprehension. "What do they say?" she asked, and her voice was softer now, less commanding, less certain, because the inscriptions were having an effect on her that she could not explain, a hypnotic quality that was drawing her in, making her want to read more, to understand more, to lose herself in the labyrinth of meaning that the symbols were creating. "They speak of Daedalus," Julian said, and his voice was distant, dreamy, the voice of someone who was reading aloud from a text that was not in front of him but was rather in his mind, being transmitted directly from the wall to his consciousness through some mechanism that bypassed the eyes and the optic nerves and went straight into the language centers of the brain. They speak of the craftsman, the inventor, the architect who built this place not as a prison for the Minotaur, but as a body for the Minotaur, a form that would contain the spirit of the thing that had been created by the gods and was too terrible to be allowed to walk freely in the world of men. They say that the labyrinth is not a structure but an organism, not a prison but a skin, not a maze but a mind, and that the Minotaur is not a prisoner in the labyrinth, but is rather the labyrinth itself, the consciousness that inhabits the stone and the plaster and the air and the darkness, the awareness that moves the walls and shifts the angles and creates the geometry that disorients and digests and consumes. The group stood in silence, the only sounds the hum of their flashlights and the distant drip of water from somewhere deep in the labyrinth, and Helena felt her skepticism beginning to crack, her rationalism beginning to crumble, her belief in the solidity of matter and the predictability of physics beginning to erode under the pressure of what she was seeing, what she was measuring, what she was experiencing in this impossible place where the walls moved and the inscriptions spoke, and the darkness seemed to breathe with a rhythm that was not human, but was not entirely inhuman either, was rather something in between, something that combined the organic and the mechanical in ways that suggested a level of technology or magic, or something else that had no name in any human language, that transcended the categories of science and superstition and existed in a realm of its own. "This is nonsense," Thomas said, and his voice was loud, belligerent, the voice of a man who was trying to drown out his own fear with the volume of his denial. "This is fairy tales. This is mythology. This is the kind of rubbish that archaeologists tell each other when they've been underground too long and the carbon monoxide has started to affect their brains. The labyrinth is a building, the Minotaur is a legend, and the only thing that's going to consume us is the greed of the people who are paying for this expedition, which is to say ourselves." But even as he spoke, the passage shifted, the walls moving with a sound like stone grinding against stone, like teeth chewing, like something enormous turning in its sleep, and the junction where they stood was no longer a junction but was rather a corridor. A single passage that extended forward into darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the passage they had entered from was gone, sealed, vanished as though it had never existed, leaving them with no way back, no way out, no way to escape except forward into the depths, into the darkness, into the belly of the beast that was not a beast but was rather the labyrinth itself. They walked for what felt like hours, or perhaps it was minutes, time having lost its meaning in the shifting geometry of the passages, and Helena measured and remeasured and found that they were walking in a perfect circle, covering miles of distance without changing their position relative to the entrance, which was impossible, which was absurd, which was happening nonetheless with a persistence that defied her instruments and her understanding and her sanity. "We're circling," she said, and her voice was hollow, empty, the voice of someone who had reached the limits of her expertise and was now merely observing the impossible, documenting the incomprehensible, recording the data that would make her famous or insane or dead, depending on whether they ever found their way out of this place. "We've been walking for 3 hours, according to my watch, and we've covered approximately 8 kilometers according to my pedometer. But the inertial navigation system says we haven't moved more than 50 meters from the entrance, and the compass says we're facing north even though the passage is curving to the right, and the gyroscope says we're walking on level ground even though my inner ear says we're climbing, and nothing makes sense, nothing at all. The labyrinth is disorienting us," Julian said, and his voice was calm, detached, the voice of a scholar who had encountered an anomaly and was now studying it with the same clinical distance he applied to ancient texts. "It's designed to confuse the inner ear, to disrupt the sense of balance, to create a cognitive dissonance between what we see and what we feel and what we know, so that we can't trust our senses, can't trust our instruments, can't trust anything except the labyrinth itself, which is exactly what it wants. Because once we stop trusting ourselves, we become dependent on it, we become part of it, we become food for the consciousness that inhabits these walls. Food, Marcus repeated, and his voice was high, thin, cracking with the pressure of a fear that he had been trying to suppress since they entered the labyrinth and was now breaking through the surface of his composure like water through a dam. What do you mean, food? We're not food. We're not here to be eaten. We're here to find art, to find treasure, to find things that we can sell, things that we can own, things that we can take back to the surface and display in our houses and our museums and our private collections. We're not food, we're not prey, we're not victims, we're customers, we're clients, we're the people who paid for this expedition and we're going to get what we paid for. But the labyrinth did not care about customers, did not recognize clients, did not acknowledge the transactions of money and power that governed the world above, and it continued to shift and move and rearrange itself around them. The passages narrowing and widening and branching and converging in patterns that suggested not randomness but intention, not chaos but design. Not the accidental geometry of natural caves, but the deliberate architecture of a mind that was playing with them, toying with them, preparing them for something that they could not imagine, could not conceive, could not even fear properly because it was so far beyond their experience, so far beyond their understanding, so far beyond the categories of threat and danger and death that human minds had evolved to process. And then, at the next junction, they heard a human voice calling from around the corner, from a passage that was not on their map, from a direction that did not exist according to their instruments. And the voice was familiar, was recognizable, was the voice of someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who had been with them when they entered the labyrinth but was no longer with them now. Helena, the voice called, and it was Julian's voice, or rather it was a voice that sounded exactly like Julian's voice, that had the same timbre and the same cadence and the same slight hesitation before certain consonants that marked Julian's speech patterns. Helena, I'm over here. I've found something amazing, something that explains everything, something that will get us out of this place. Come and see, come quickly, before it moves, before it changes, before it disappears. But Julian was standing right beside Helena, his flashlight illuminating the passage ahead, his hand on her arm, and they both looked at each other with expressions of confusion and horror, and the dawning realization that the voice was not Julian's voice, but was rather the labyrinth's voice. The Minotaur's voice. The sound of something that could mimic human speech with perfect fidelity, that could reproduce the voices of its prey with a precision that was indistinguishable from the original, that could lure them into blind alleys and dead ends and places where the walls would close and the digestion would begin. Don't answer it, Reed said, and his voice was sharp, commanding, the voice of a soldier who had encountered ambushes before, who had learned to recognize bait and traps and the strategies of enemies who wanted to lure their prey into vulnerable positions. Don't acknowledge it, don't follow it, don't give it any indication that we've heard it or that we're interested in what it's offering. It's a trap, it's always a trap, and the only way to survive a trap is to avoid it, to walk away from it, to refuse to engage with it on any level. But the voice called again, and this time it was Helena's voice, or rather a voice that sounded exactly like Helena's voice, calling to Julian, calling to Reed, calling to the financiers with a warmth and an intimacy that suggested knowledge, familiarity, trust. And Julian took a step toward the passage from which the voice was emanating, a step that was involuntary, reflexive, driven by the same instinct that made human beings respond to the voices of their loved ones, the same neural wiring that made it impossible to ignore a call for help, a plea for assistance, a promise of rescue from someone who sounded exactly like the person you most wanted to see in a moment of danger and despair. Reed grabbed Julian's arm and pulled him back, his grip like iron, his face set in a mask of determination that suggested he was fighting not merely the lure of the voice but his own impulses, his own desires, his own need to believe that there was someone in this labyrinth who could help them, who could save them, who could lead them out of the darkness and into the light. "It's not real," Reed said, and his voice was strained, hoarse, the voice of a man who was using all his willpower to resist something that was stronger than willpower, something that was speaking directly to the deepest parts of his brain, the parts that processed language and meaning, and the social bonds that held human communities together. "It's not Julian, it's not Helena, it's the thing that lives here, the thing that hunts here, the thing that's been waiting for people like us to enter its domain so that it can play with us, can confuse us, can consume us at its leisure. We have to keep moving, we have to stay together, we have to find the center or the exit or whatever this place has that passes for a way out. And we have to do it without listening to the voices, without following the lights, without trusting anything that we see or hear or feel in this place of lies and shadows, and the endless hunger of something that is not a beast but is rather a god." They pressed on, moving through passages that narrowed until they had to walk single file, that widened until they could have driven a truck through them, that sloped upward and downward and sideways in ways that made the inner ear rebel and the stomach turn, and the mind struggle to maintain any coherent sense of orientation, any reliable map of the space they were moving through. The youngest member of the team, a graduate student named David Park, who had been hired as an assistant to Julian, and who had been included in the expedition because his family had connections to one of the financiers, was walking at the rear of the group, his flashlight flickering with a weakness that suggested the batteries were failing, his breathing rapid and shallow in the thick air of the lower levels, and he was lagging behind, falling back, creating a gap between himself and the others that was small at first, and then larger and then dangerous. Because in a labyrinth where the walls moved and the geometry shifted, and the voices mimicked the sounds of loved ones, being separated from the group was the first step toward being consumed by the darkness, the first stage of the process that would end with the wet snap of bones and the silence of the dead. "David, keep up," Helena called back to him, and her voice was sharp with the anxiety of someone who understood the dangers of separation, who knew that the labyrinth was waiting for them to make exactly this mistake, to allow exactly this gap, to create exactly this opportunity for the thing that hunted them to pick off the weakest, the slowest, the most vulnerable member of the herd. "I'm trying," David called back, and his voice was thin, reedy, the voice of a young man who was exhausted and frightened and rapidly approaching the limit of what he could endure. "But my light is dying and I can't see where I'm going and the walls are moving and I think I'm lost. I think I've lost you. I think I'm alone." And then his voice cut off, not gradually but instantly, as though a switch had been flipped, and the silence that followed was absolute, complete, the silence of a space where sound had ceased to exist, where the air had become too thick to transmit vibrations, where the darkness had swallowed not only the light but the sound as well. And when Helena turned around and shone her flashlight back down the passage, David was gone, vanished. Disappeared from a corridor that had no side passages, no hiding places, no exits except the one they had entered from, and the only trace of his presence was his flashlight, lying on the floor where he had dropped it, its beam still weakly illuminating a patch of wall that was covered in inscriptions that seemed to shift and change even as Helena watched. That seemed to be writing themselves in real time, composing a message that was not for human eyes but was rather for the thing that had taken David, the thing that was even now digesting him somewhere in the depths of the labyrinth, somewhere behind the walls, somewhere in the negative space that existed between the passages and the chambers and the geometries that human instruments could not measure. They searched for him, of course, because they were human beings and human beings did not abandon their companions to the darkness without at least making an effort to find them, to rescue them, to confirm that they were dead rather than merely missing. And they called his name and shone their lights into every corner and crevice and shadow, and they found nothing, absolutely nothing, no body, no blood, no sign of struggle, No indication that anything had happened except the absence of David, the silence where his voice had been, the emptiness where his presence had been. "He's gone," Reed said, and his voice was flat, resigned, the voice of a soldier who had seen men disappear before, who had learned that sometimes people vanished and were never found, who understood that the labyrinth was not a place where search and rescue operations could be conducted with any hope of success. Something took him, something that doesn't leave traces, doesn't make noise, doesn't give its prey any chance to scream or fight or even know what's happening. We need to keep moving, we need to stay together, we need to be more careful, more vigilant, more suspicious of everything we see and hear and feel in this place. But they were already suspicious, already vigilant, already careful, and it had not been enough because David was gone and they were still here. And the labyrinth was still shifting, and the walls were still moving, and the voice was still calling from passages that did not exist. And Helena understood with a clarity that made her knees weak and her vision blur that they were not going to find their way out of this place by being careful, by being vigilant, by being suspicious. Because the labyrinth was smarter than they were, was older than they were, was more patient than they were, and it had all the time in the world to play with them, to confuse them, to consume them one by one until there was nothing left but the bones and the silence and the endless hunger of the thing that was not a Minotaur but was rather something worse. Something that had been folded into the shape of a Minotaur by the geometry of Daedalus and the malice of the gods, and the endless suffering of the creature that wore that shape as a mask, as a disguise, as a form that concealed its true nature from the human beings who entered its domain and became its food. They continued to walk, or rather they continued to move, because walking was no longer an accurate description of what they were doing. What with the shifting floors and the tilting walls and the passages that seemed to slope in multiple directions simultaneously, creating a sensation of movement that was not forward or backward or upward or downward, but was rather inward. Always inward, toward the center of the spiral, toward the heart of the labyrinth, toward the place where the Minotaur waited and watched and hungered for the fear that was its true sustenance, the terror that was its true nourishment, the despair that was the seasoning it required to transform mere flesh into something that satisfied the appetite of a god. And as they moved, as they stumbled, as they fell and rose and fell again in the darkness that was not merely absence of light, but was rather presence of something else, something that pressed against their skin and filled their lungs and seeped into their minds with a coldness that was not temperature, but was rather the cold of the void. The cold of space, the cold of a place where life had never existed and could not exist and would never exist except as food for the thing that inhabited the stone and the plaster and the darkness. Helena began to hear something that was not the voice, not the movement of the walls, not the breathing of the labyrinth, but was rather something deeper, something older, something that resonated in the bones of her skull and the chambers of her heart and the synapses of her brain with a frequency that was not sound but was rather meaning, was rather communication, was rather the voice of the labyrinth itself speaking directly to her consciousness in a language that had no words but had only implications, only suggestions, only the slow transmission of a message that she could not refuse and could not ignore and could not escape. The message was simple, terrifying in its simplicity, devastating in its clarity. You are not lost. You are being led. You are not victims. You are volunteers. You entered of your own free will. You descended of your own free will. You will be consumed of your own free will because the labyrinth does not take what is not given, does not consume what is not offered, does not destroy what does not come to it seeking destruction. You are the offering, the sacrifice, the meal that walks to the table and seats itself and waits for the knife to fall, and your fear is the prayer that sanctifies the feast, the blessing that makes the flesh holy, the devotion that transforms mere hunger into communion. Helena stumbled and fell, her body collapsing against a wall that was warm, that was pulsing, that was alive with a rhythm that matched the rhythm of her own heart but was slower, deeper, more ancient, and she pressed her palm against the wall and felt it move beneath her hand. Felt the stone flex and contract like muscle, like tissue, like the living substance of an organism that was not made of cells and proteins, but was rather made of geometry and intention, and the pure mathematical expression of hunger that had been encoded into the architecture by Daedalus himself, by the craftsman who had understood that the Minotaur was not a monster to be imprisoned, but was rather a god to be fed, a deity to be worshipped, an appetite to be satisfied by the regular sacrifice of human beings who entered the labyrinth voluntarily, who descended into the darkness willingly, who became the food that sustained the consciousness of the place and maintained the equilibrium of the cosmic order that depended on the regular consumption of fear and flesh and the particular chemical signature of human despair. She pulled her hand away from the wall and stared at her palm, expecting to see blood or dust or some residue of the contact, but her hand was clean, was dry, was unmarked except for the faint indentation of the wall's texture, the pattern of the stone that had pressed itself into her skin like a brand, like a seal, like the mark of ownership that claimed her as property, as food, as the next course in an endless meal that stretched back through millennia and would continue forward through millennia more. "What is it?" Julian asked, and he was kneeling beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes searching her face for some indication of what she had seen, what she had felt, what she had understood in the moment of contact with the living wall, and Helena looked at him and saw the fear in his eyes, the confusion, the desperation, and she knew that she could not tell him, could not explain, could not share the knowledge that had been transmitted to her, because to share it would be to spread the infection, to propagate the understanding, to make him complicit in the horror that was consuming them, that was preparing them, that was arranging them for the moment when the Minotaur would emerge from the center of the labyrinth and claim its due. "We need to keep moving," she said, and her voice was steady, controlled, the voice of an engineer who had encountered a problem and was now working on a solution, the voice of a professional who refused to be defeated by the impossible, the voice of a woman who was determined to survive even if survival meant denying what she knew, suppressing what she felt, pretending that the world was still governed by the laws of physics and the principles of rationality, even as the evidence to the contrary pressed against her from every side, from every wall, from every shadow that moved with purposes of its own in the flickering light of their failing flashlights. "We need to find the center, or the exit, or whatever this place has that passes for a way out, and we need to do it together, as a team, without separating, without panicking, without giving in to the fear that is exactly what this place wants from us." But even as she spoke, she knew that the fear was already given, already surrendered, already offered up as the first course in the feast that the labyrinth was preparing, because they were all afraid, all of them, the financiers and the soldiers and the scholars and the engineers, all of them trembling and sweating and breathing in shallow gasps that were the physiological signature of terror, the chemical cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol, and the pheromones of panic that the labyrinth was absorbing through its walls, through its floors, through the very air that they were breathing, and she understood that the Minotaur was not merely waiting for them at the center, but was rather all around them, was rather the labyrinth itself, was rather the sum total of the shifting passages and the moving walls and the voices that mimicked and the geometry that disoriented and the darkness that pressed against their skin like a mouth closing around food. They moved forward or inward or downward or in some direction that had no name in human language, and the passages became narrower, the walls closer, the ceiling lower, until they were crawling rather than walking, squeezing through spaces that were barely large enough for their bodies. Feeling the stone press against their chests and their backs and their sides with a pressure that was not merely physical but was rather psychological, the weight of the earth above them and the darkness around them, and the knowledge that they were deep, so deep, deeper than any human being should be, deeper than any light could reach, deeper than any rescue could penetrate, and that if the labyrinth decided to collapse, to close, to digest them here and now, there would be nothing they could do, no way to fight, no way to escape, no way to survive except by the grace of the thing that was not a god but was worshipped like a god, that was not alive but was fed like a living thing, that was not conscious but spoke in the language of geometry and fear, and the endless hunger that had been encoded into the stone by Daedalus, and was now being decoded into their flesh, by the slow process of consumption that had begun the moment they entered the labyrinth, and would not end, until there was nothing left of them, but the bones and the silence and the memory of the fear that had seasoned their flesh, and made it worthy of the feast. The larder was not a room in any conventional sense, because the labyrinth did not have rooms in the way that human buildings had rooms, with walls and floors and ceilings that defined enclosed spaces with specific functions and specific boundaries. The larder was rather a chamber that had been formed by the convergence of multiple passages, a nexus point where the shifting geometry of the maze had created a space that was larger than it should have been, that extended in directions that the eye could not follow, that seemed to recede into a distance that suggested the labyrinth was not merely underground, but was rather somehow connected to other places, other times, other dimensions that existed parallel to the physical reality of the Cretan bedrock. And in that chamber, arranged in concentric circles that matched the spiral pattern of the necropolis above, and the constellation in the sky and the very structure of the labyrinth itself, were the bones. They were human bones, bleached white by centuries of exposure to the strange atmosphere of the lower levels, stripped clean of flesh and marrow, and every organic substance that might have decayed or rotted or attracted the attention of scavengers. And they were arranged with a precision that suggested not the random accumulation of a predator's leavings, but rather the deliberate curation of an artist's gallery, a museum of death that had been assembled with an aesthetic sensibility that transcended mere hunger and approached the realm of devotion, of worship, of the kind of obsessive attention to detail that characterized religious ritual and artistic creation, and the madness of collectors who arranged their treasures not for display, but for private contemplation, for the satisfaction of an appetite that was not physical, but was rather spiritual, psychological, existential in ways that Helena could not understand but could recognize, could feel in the pit of her stomach as she stood at the entrance to the chamber, and felt the weight of the accumulated death pressing against her like a physical force, like the gravity of a planet that was composed entirely of the compressed remains of the dead. There were hundreds of skeletons, perhaps thousands, arranged in rings that radiated outward from a central point, where a single skull sat upon a pedestal of black stone, and the skull was not human, or rather it was not merely human, because it bore the horns of a bull, the elongated nasal cavity of a bovine, the eye sockets that were too large and too deep for any primate skull, and yet the cranial structure was human, was recognizably human. Was the skull of a man who had been transformed or deformed or folded into a shape that was not his own by forces that Helena could not imagine and did not want to imagine, by the geometry of Daedalus that was not merely architecture but was rather something else, something that could alter flesh as easily as it altered stone, that could reshape bone as easily as it reshaped plaster, that could turn a human being into a monster and a monster into a god. "This is what it does," Julian whispered, and his voice was barely audible in the vastness of the chamber, swallowed by the space and returned as an echo that was distorted, fragmented, unrecognizable, as though the labyrinth were sampling his voice and using it to compose a reply that was not quite human. "This is what it has always done, what it was designed to do, what Daedalus created it for. It's not a prison, it's a gallery, and we're not prisoners. We're exhibits, and the Minotaur is not the prisoner but the curator, the artist, the one who arranges the bones and preserves the remains and maintains the collection that stretches back through centuries and will stretch forward through centuries more. "Stop it," Thomas said, and his voice was harsh, brutal. The voice of a man who was trying to drown out the implications of what they were seeing with the volume of his denial. "Stop talking like that. Stop making it worse than it already is. Stop pretending that this is some kind of supernatural gallery when it's clearly just a garbage dump, a trash heap, a place where some animal has been dragging its kills for years, for decades, for however long this cave system has been here. There's no curator, there's no artist, there's no God, there's just a predator and its prey, and we're the prey, and if we don't stop standing around admiring the decor and start finding a way out, we're going to be the next exhibit in this so-called gallery." But even as he spoke, Helena saw something that made her blood run cold, that made her knees weak, that made her vision narrow to a tunnel of darkness with the bones at the center, and the reality of their situation pressing in from all sides. She saw movement among the skeletons, not the movement of rats or insects or any of the scavengers that should have been present in a chamber full of organic remains, but rather the movement of arrangement, of adjustment, of curation, as though something invisible were moving through the rings of bones and repositioning them, straightening a femur here, adjusting a ribcage there, tilting a skull to catch the light of their flashlights in a way that created a shadow that looked almost like a face, almost like an expression, almost like a message that was being written in the language of bone and darkness, and the particular acoustics of a space that was not merely large but was rather infinite, was rather eternal, was rather the final destination of every human being who had ever entered the labyrinth and failed to escape. And then she saw the gifts. They were placed at the entrance to the chamber, arranged in a pattern that was not random but was rather directional, pointing toward a passage that led deeper into the labyrinth, deeper into the darkness, deeper into the center of the spiral where the Minotaur waited and watched and hungered for the next course in its endless meal. The gifts were the severed limbs of David Park, the graduate student who had vanished from the passage behind them, who had been taken silently and swiftly, and without any trace of struggle, and whose remains were now being presented to them with the same meticulous care that the skeletons had received. The same aesthetic attention, the same curatorial sensibility that suggested the Minotaur was not merely feeding, but was rather communicating, was rather expressing something that could not be said in words, but could only be conveyed through the medium of flesh and bone, and the particular arrangement of body parts in space. David's right arm was extended, the index finger pointing toward the passage that led deeper, as though he were gesturing, indicating, guiding them toward the exit that lay in that direction, or perhaps toward something else, something that was not the exit but was rather the opposite of the exit. The center, the heart, the place where the spiral closed and the circle was completed, and the final act of the drama was played out in blood and terror, and the wet sounds of consumption that echoed through the labyrinth like a symphony composed in the key of fear. His left leg was bent at the knee, the foot positioned as though in mid-stride, as though he were walking, running, fleeing toward the passage that his arm was pointing toward, and his head, his beautiful young head with the eyes that were still open and still staring and still filled with the terror of his final moments, was turned to face them, to look at them, to judge them for their failure to save him, their failure to protect him, their failure to prevent him from becoming the latest addition to the gallery of the dead that the Minotaur had been curating for centuries. "It's showing us the way out," Marcus said, and his voice was hopeful, desperate, the voice of a man who had found a reason to believe in survival and was clinging to that belief with a tenacity that was pathetic in its transparency. "It's telling us which way to go, it's giving us directions, it's helping us escape. Maybe it doesn't want to kill us all, maybe it only wants some of us. Maybe it's like a lion that only needs one antelope and lets the rest of the herd go free. Maybe if we follow the pointing arm, if we go in the direction it's indicating, we'll find the exit, we'll find the way back to the surface, we'll find the light and the air and the world above where things like this don't exist, can't exist, aren't allowed to exist." "It's not showing us the exit," Reed said, and his voice was flat. Hard, the voice of a soldier who had seen traps before, who had learned to recognize bait and lures and the strategies of enemies who wanted to draw their prey into vulnerable positions. It's showing us the way deeper, the way inward, the way toward the center where the thing lives, where it waits, where it feeds. The pointing arm is not a gesture of help but a gesture of invitation, not a guide to safety but a lure to destruction. And if we follow it, we're walking straight into its mouth, straight into its stomach, straight into the digestion that it has been planning since the moment we entered its domain. Helena looked at the arm, at the leg, at the head with its open eyes and its frozen terror, and she saw what Reed had seen, understood what Reed had understood. Felt the truth of his words in the same primitive parts of her brain that processed danger and threat and the approach of things that could not be fought, could not be escaped, could only be avoided by refusing to engage, by refusing to follow, by refusing to accept the narrative that the Minotaur was constructing for them, the story that led inevitably to the center of the labyrinth where the final chapter was written in blood, and the last page was turned by teeth that were not human, but were not entirely animal either. They turned away from the passage that the arm was pointing toward, turned toward a different passage, a narrower passage, a darker passage that led in a direction that was not the center and not the exit but was rather tangential, peripheral, a path that skirted the edge of the labyrinth's geometry without approaching its heart, and they moved with a speed that was born of renewed terror, of the understanding that the Minotaur was not merely waiting for them but was actively herding them, guiding them, manipulating their movements with the same curatorial precision that it applied to the arrangement of the bones, the positioning of the limbs, the composition of the gallery that was its life's work, its eternal project, its reason for existence. And as they moved, as they stumbled through the darkness with their flashlights flickering and their breath coming in ragged gasps and their hearts hammering against their ribs with a rhythm that suggested imminent collapse, Helena became aware of something that she had not noticed before. Something that was not a sound or a sight or a smell, but was rather a sensation, a vibration, a rhythm that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves and to synchronize with the beating of her heart, the pulsing of her blood, the electrical activity of her brain. The walls were moving, she realized, not randomly, not in the chaotic shifting that had characterized their passage through the upper levels, but rather rhythmically, pulsing, breathing, expanding and contracting in a cycle that matched her own cardiac rhythm. And when her heart rate increased, when her fear mounted, when her panic began to overwhelm her reason, the walls contracted, the passage narrowed, the ceiling lowered, and the space became smaller, tighter, more confining, as though the labyrinth were responding to her terror by squeezing her, compressing her, crushing her under the weight of her own fear. And when she forced herself to calm down, to breathe deeply, to slow her heart rate through sheer force of will, the walls relaxed, the passage widened, the ceiling rose, and the space became larger, more open, more survivable, as though the labyrinth were rewarding her composure with a temporary reprieve, with a moment of space, with an illusion of safety that would be withdrawn the moment her fear returned. "The walls are reacting to our heart rates," she gasped, and her voice was barely audible above the sound of her own breathing and the pulsing of the stone and the distant subsonic hum that seemed to be the labyrinth's voice, its consciousness, its way of communicating with the prey that it was slowly digesting. "When we panic, the walls close in, and when we calm down, they open up, and the Minotaur isn't just hunting us, it's farming us. It's cultivating our fear, it's harvesting our terror the way a farmer harvests wheat, waiting for the crop to reach the perfect ripeness before cutting it down and grinding it into flour. Then we need to stay calm," Julian said, and his voice was trembling with the effort of maintaining composure in a situation that demanded panic, that rewarded panic, that was designed to produce panic as its primary output, its essential product, its reason for existence. "We need to control our breathing, slow our heart rates, keep our fear in check, Because if we don't, the walls will close and will be crushed before the Minotaur even has a chance to eat us. We'll be ground into paste by the stone itself, and our remains will be added to the gallery without the benefit of preparation, without the aesthetic attention, without the curatorial care that the creature apparently values so highly. They walked in silence then, or rather in the controlled silence of people who were forcing themselves to be quiet, to be calm, to be composed in the face of something that was specifically designed to destroy their composure. And Helena felt the walls relax around her, felt the passage widen, felt the ceiling rise, and she knew that Julian was right, that the labyrinth responded to panic, that the Minotaur fed on fear, and that their only hope of survival lay in maintaining a state of stoic detachment that was utterly unnatural, completely impossible, and yet absolutely necessary if they were to escape the crushing geometry of the maze that was not merely a structure but was rather a mechanism, a machine, a living organism that measured their terror and adjusted its shape accordingly. But maintaining calm in the face of the Minotaur was not merely difficult, it was impossible, because the creature did not wait for them to reach the center before it began its hunt, did not allow them to wander in peaceful ignorance until the final moment of revelation. It hunted them as they moved, stalked them through the passages, grazed them with its presence in the darkness, letting them know that it was there, that it was close, that it could take them at any moment but was choosing not to, was choosing to play with them, to toy with them, to extend the pleasure of the hunt across minutes or hours or days before the final act of consumption. They heard it before they saw it, heard the breathing that was not human, not animal, but was rather the sound of something enormous moving through the confined spaces of the labyrinth with a grace that was impossible for its size, a fluidity that suggested it was not solid but was rather liquid, not matter but was rather energy, not bound by the laws of physics that constrained ordinary creatures, but was rather free to move through walls and floors and ceilings, as though they were merely suggestions, guidelines, recommendations rather than absolute barriers. The breathing was heavy, rhythmic, wet, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the air itself, as though the labyrinth were inhaling and exhaling them, breathing them in and breathing them out, tasting them with each respiratory cycle, and finding them pleasing, acceptable, worthy of the extended preparation that the Minotaur was applying to their case. "It's here," Reed whispered, and his hand was on his weapon, his finger on the trigger, his body tense with the readiness of a soldier who had faced death before and knew that the only response to its approach was violence, aggression, the determination to take as many of the enemy with him as possible before the inevitable end. "It's close, it's very close, and when it comes, we need to be ready, we need to fight. We need to hurt it if we can, kill it if we can, because surrender is not an option, submission is not an option, becoming part of its gallery is not an option that I am willing to accept." They moved through the passage in a tight formation, Reed in the lead with his weapon raised, Helena behind him with her flashlight sweeping across the walls and floor, and ceiling in search of any sign of movement, any indication of the creature's position, any warning that would give them a fraction of a second to react before the attack came. And the Minotaur was there, was always there, was visible only as a disturbance in the air, a ripple in the darkness, a pressure against the skin that suggested something large and heavy and very, very close was moving just beyond the range of their flashlights, just outside the cone of illumination that was their only defense against the absolute blackness of the lower levels. They could smell it, a musk that was not the musk of any animal that Helena had ever encountered, not the sharp tang of predator urine or the sweet rot of carnivore breath, but rather something else, something that combined the smells of earth and stone and blood and fear into a single olfactory signature that was unmistakable, unforgettable, the scent of the labyrinth itself, the body odor of the Minotaur, the personal fragrance of the thing that was hunting them. And they could feel it, feel the heat that radiated from its body, feel the displacement of air that marked its passage, feel the vibration of the floor that suggested something enormous was walking beside them, matching their pace, keeping time with their steps, moving in parallel with their trajectory through the maze without ever quite intersecting, never quite attacking, never quite revealing itself in the full light of their flashlights, but always remaining at the edge, in the periphery, in the negative space where visibility ended and imagination began. The attack, when it came, was not directed at the group, but rather at Reed, the combat veteran, the security specialist, the man who had been hired to protect them and who was now being singled out for destruction with a precision that suggested the Minotaur understood his role, understood his function, understood that he was the most dangerous member of the party, and therefore the one who needed to be neutralized first, removed from the board before the game could proceed to its conclusion. It happened in a passage that was barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast, a passage where the walls were close and the ceiling was low, and the flashlights illuminated only a few meters ahead before the darkness swallowed their beams, and Reed was in the lead, his weapon tracking back and forth across the space in front of him, his eyes straining against the darkness for any sign of the creature that he knew was there, that he could feel was there, that his instincts told him was mere inches away, waiting for the moment of his distraction, his exhaustion, his mistake. And the moment came, not because Reed made a mistake, but because the Minotaur created one, a sound from behind them, a shift in the air pressure, a suggestion of movement that made Reed spin around to face the threat that was not there, that was a decoy, that was the misdirection that allowed the real attack to come from the front, from the direction that Reed was no longer facing, from the darkness that his flashlight was no longer illuminating. The Minotaur emerged from the wall, not from a doorway or an opening, but from the solid stone itself, as though the rock were merely a curtain that could be pushed aside, a veil that could be lifted, and it was upon Reed before he could turn back, before he could raise his weapon, before he could do anything except register the presence of something enormous and dark and smelling of earth and blood, and the particular musk of the labyrinth itself. The creature did not kill him immediately, did not tear him apart with the ferocity that its size and strength would have suggested, but rather pinned him against the wall with a gentleness that was more terrifying than violence would have been, a careful restraint that suggested the Minotaur was not merely subduing its prey, but was rather positioning it, arranging it, preparing it for some purpose that was not immediately clear, but would become so in the minutes and hours that followed. Reed struggled, his muscles straining against the pressure that held him immobile, his weapon forgotten on the floor where it had fallen, his hands clawing at the stone behind him, and the horns that pressed against his chest with a force that was not crushing but was rather supporting, holding him in place, keeping him upright, maintaining him in a position that was functional, visible, useful. And the Minotaur stepped back, or rather it moved away, its bulk withdrawing into the darkness from which it had emerged, leaving Reed pinned to the wall by the horns that had penetrated his clothing and his skin, and lodged in the muscle of his chest with a precision that suggested the creature knew exactly where to strike, exactly how deep to go, exactly how to immobilize without killing, to injure without destroying, to create a situation where the prey was alive but helpless, conscious but immobilized, aware of his fate but unable to prevent it. "Reed!" Helena screamed, and she lunged forward, but Julian grabbed her arm and held her back, because the Minotaur was still there, still visible at the edge of their flashlight beams, still watching them with eyes that were not human and not animal but were rather something else. Something that glowed with a light of their own, a pale luminescence that suggested the creature could see in spectrums that human eyes could not perceive, could track them by heat or by electromagnetic field, or by some sense that had no name in any human language. "Don't," Julian whispered, and his voice was urgent, desperate, the voice of a man who understood that the Minotaur was using Reed as bait, as a lure, as a way to draw the rest of them into a position where they could be attacked, could be pinned, could be added to the gallery of the dead that the creature was curating with such meticulous care. It's a trap. It's using him to get to us. And if we go to him, if we try to help him, we'll be in the same position, pinned to the wall, immobilized, waiting for the end. We can't just leave him, Helena said, and her voice was breaking, cracking under the pressure of the choice between compassion and survival, between the human impulse to help a fallen comrade and the animal instinct to flee from a predator that was stronger and faster and more intelligent than any of them. We can't just let him die, let him suffer, let him become part of the Minotaur's collection without even trying to save him. We can't save him, Julian said, and his voice was flat, resigned, the voice of a man who had accepted the reality of their situation and was now merely calculating the odds. The probabilities, the chances of survival that diminished with each minute they spent in the labyrinth, with each encounter with the creature, with each moment of fear that fed the Minotaur and strengthened its hold on the maze that was its body and its mind and its eternal hunting ground. And if we try, we die too, and then there's no one left to tell the story, no one left to warn the world, no one left to prevent the next expedition from making the same mistake, from entering the same trap, from becoming the next exhibits in the gallery that stretches back through centuries and will stretch forward through centuries more. They backed away from Reed, from the horns that pinned him to the wall, from the eyes that glowed in the darkness with an intelligence that was ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to their moral anguish, their guilt, their shame at abandoning a comrade to a fate that was worse than death, that was rather a prolongation of death, a suspension of life in a state of helpless terror that would continue until the Minotaur decided it was time to feed, time to add Reed's bones to the collection, time to move on to the next course in the endless meal. And as they retreated, as they moved deeper into the labyrinth, away from Reed and his silent suffering, away from the Minotaur and its glowing eyes, away from the passage where the combat veteran had been neutralized and transformed from protector to bait, they found the inscriptions that Julian had been seeking, the writings that explained the origin of the creature, the history of the labyrinth, the purpose of the geometry that had been created not by human hands alone but by something else, something that had worked through Daedalus, that had used the craftsman as a tool, a vessel, a medium for the expression of a design that was not human in origin and not human in intention. The inscriptions were carved into the walls of a chamber that opened off the main passage, a chamber that was small and quiet, and seemed somehow protected from the shifting geometry of the labyrinth, as though it were a sanctuary, a safe space, a place where the Minotaur's influence was weaker, and the walls remained still, and the air was breathable, and the darkness was merely darkness rather than the presence of something that watched and waited and hungered. Julian read them aloud, his voice trembling with the excitement of discovery and the horror of understanding, and Helena listened with a growing sense of dread that was not the immediate terror of the hunt, but was rather the slower, deeper fear of comprehension, of knowing, of understanding exactly what they were facing and exactly how hopeless their situation truly was. Daedalus did not build the labyrinth to imprison the Minotaur, Julian read, his finger tracing the symbols that seemed to glow with their own faint luminescence in the darkness of the chamber. He built it to create the Minotaur, to shape the Minotaur, to fold a human being into the form of a beast, using the geometry of the maze itself. The king's son, the prince, the boy who was sacrificed to the bull, was not killed by the Minotaur, but was rather transformed into the Minotaur, his body bent and twisted and reshaped by the angles of the passages and the curves of the walls and the mathematics of the spiral, until he was no longer human, but was rather something else. Something that combined the intelligence of a man with the appetite of a beast, something that was neither and both, something that existed in the space between categories, between definitions, between the laws of nature and the desires of the gods. And the labyrinth is not merely the Minotaur's prison, but is rather the Minotaur's body, its mind, its consciousness. And every passage is a nerve, every wall is a muscle, every shift in the geometry is a thought, an intention, a movement of the will that seeks to consume, to digest, to transform the fear of its prey into the energy that sustains its existence, that maintains its form, that allows it to continue curating the gallery of the dead that is both its nourishment and its art, its sustenance and its expression, its survival and its purpose. Helena listened to these words and felt her sanity begin to fracture, because the implications were clear, were devastating, were utterly without hope. The Minotaur was not a creature that could be killed, because it was not merely a creature but was rather the labyrinth itself, was rather the stone and the plaster and the darkness and the geometry that defined the space they were moving through. And to kill the Minotaur would require destroying the labyrinth, would require collapsing the passages and crushing the chambers and burying themselves in the rubble of their own destruction, would require a sacrifice that was total, complete, absolute, and that would end not merely the creature's existence but their own as well. He was a man, Julian continued, and his voice was softer now, almost gentle, the voice of a scholar who had found the answer to a question that had haunted him for years and was now discovering that the answer was worse than the mystery, that the solution was more terrible than the problem. A man who was folded into this shape by Daedalus's geometry, who was transformed by the mathematics of the maze into a creature of immense pain and immense resentment, who suffers with every moment of his existence, and who expresses that suffering through the curation of the dead, through the arrangement of the bones, through the preparation of the meals that sustain him and the gallery that defines him. He doesn't want to kill us because he hates us, or because he's evil, or because he's a monster. He wants to kill us because he's in pain, because every moment of his existence is agony, because the geometry that shaped him continues to shape him, continues to fold him, continues to twist his flesh and his mind into configurations that no living thing was meant to endure, and the only relief he can find, the only escape from the suffering, is in the consumption of fear, in the absorption of terror, in the transformation of human dread into the energy that allows him to maintain his form, to preserve his sanity, to continue existing in a state that is not life but is not death either. That is rather a suspension between those states, a stasis that requires constant nourishment, constant feeding, constant replenishment from the fear of the prey that enters his domain and becomes his sustenance. Helena looked at Julian and saw the tears in his eyes, the despair in his face, the understanding that had destroyed something in him, some essential optimism, some fundamental belief in the rationality of the universe. And she knew that he was broken, that they were all broken, that the labyrinth had broken them not with violence but with comprehension, not with pain but with knowledge, not with the immediate threat of death, but with the slow erosion of hope that came from understanding exactly what they were facing and exactly how impossible it was to escape. They sat in the chamber and they rested because there was nowhere else to go, no other passage to take, no other direction that did not lead deeper into the labyrinth, closer to the center, nearer to the heart of the Minotaur's consciousness where the final act awaited them. And as they sat, as they breathed, as they tried to slow their heart rates and calm their minds and prepare themselves for whatever came next, Helena became aware of a sound that was not the breathing of the Minotaur, not the shifting of the walls, not the distant screams of Reed that had ceased hours ago and been replaced by a silence that was worse than any noise. It was a sound that came from the chamber itself, from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, a rhythmic sound, a wet sound, a sound that suggested something was moving through the stone, something was flowing through the plaster, something was approaching them not through the passages but through the substance of the labyrinth itself. And she knew with a certainty that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn that the Minotaur was coming for them, was not waiting for them to reach the center, but was rather coming to them, was bringing the center to them, was collapsing the distance between the hunter and the prey with a patience that was terrible in its implication, with a deliberation that was worse than any frenzy could have been. "It's here," she whispered, and her voice was barely audible, barely a breath, barely a sound at all, and Julian looked at her with eyes that were wide with a fear that he could no longer hide, no longer control, no longer deny, and he nodded, slowly, mechanically. The gesture of a man who had accepted the inevitable and was now merely waiting for it to arrive. And the walls of the chamber began to pulse, began to contract, began to close in around them with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats, that mirrored their terror, that amplified their fear and fed it back to them in a feedback loop of panic and compression, and the slowly diminishing space that would eventually crush them or consume them, or transform them into something that was not human, but was rather part of the gallery, part of the art, part of the eternal suffering of the Minotaur that was the labyrinth, and the labyrinth was the Minotaur, and both were the same thing, the same consciousness, the same hunger, the same endless and absolute and utterly inevitable appetite for the fear that was the only thing that could ease the pain of a creature that had been folded into a shape it was never meant to hold and would never be allowed to escape. The walls stopped moving when Helena stopped breathing, or rather when she stopped breathing in the panicked gasps that had been her response to the Minotaur's approach, and began to breathe in the slow, controlled, deliberate rhythm that she had learned in yoga classes years ago, in a life that seemed like a dream now, a memory from another world, another time, another existence that had nothing to do with the darkness and the terror, and the slowly contracting chamber that was about to become their tomb. She had noticed the correlation by accident, had felt the walls relax when her fear momentarily subsided, had observed the ceiling rise when her heart rate dropped, and she had made the connection, had understood the mechanism, had realized that the labyrinth was not merely a structure but was rather a sensor, a detector, a device that measured the electromagnetic and physiological signatures of human fear and translated those measurements into geometric adjustments, into spatial compressions, into the tightening of the noose that was the Minotaur's hunting strategy. And now, as she sat in the chamber with Julian beside her and the walls pulsing with the rhythm of their combined terror, she reached out and took his hand and squeezed it, not for comfort but for communication, not for warmth but for synchronization, and she whispered in a voice that was barely audible, barely a breath, barely a sound at all, "Breathe with me. Slowly, in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. If we can synchronize our breathing, if we can slow our heart rates together, the walls will stop moving, the chamber will stabilize, and we might be able to find a way out before the Minotaur realizes what we're doing." Julian looked at her with eyes that were wide with confusion and hope, and the desperate need to believe that there was a solution, that there was an escape, that there was a way out of the impossible situation that did not involve becoming part of the gallery of the dead. And he nodded, slowly, mechanically. And he matched his breathing to hers, inhaling when she inhaled, holding when she held, exhaling when she exhaled. And together they created a rhythm that was not merely physiological but was rather musical, mathematical, a harmonic pattern that seemed to resonate with the stone itself, that seemed to communicate with the labyrinth in a language that was older than words, older than thought, older than the fear that had been their primary mode of communication with the Minotaur since the moment they entered its domain. And the walls responded. The contraction slowed, the pulsing became less insistent, the pressure that had been squeezing them from all sides began to ease, and the chamber stabilized, became still, became quiet, became a space that was merely dark rather than actively hostile, merely enclosed rather than aggressively compressing. Helena felt a surge of hope that was immediately followed by a surge of fear, because she knew that hope was dangerous in this place, that optimism was a vulnerability that the Minotaur could exploit, that the moment she allowed herself to believe in escape, in survival, in the possibility of returning to the world above, Her heart rate would increase, and the walls would contract again, and the opportunity would be lost. So she suppressed the hope, crushed it, buried it beneath a layer of stoic detachment that was as artificial as it was necessary. And she maintained the rhythm, maintained the synchronization, maintained the slow, steady breathing that was their only defense against the geometry of fear that the labyrinth employed. "We need to move," she whispered, and her voice was steady, controlled, devoid of emotion. The voice of an engineer who had found a solution to a technical problem and was now implementing it with the same methodical precision she applied to any construction challenge. "But we need to move slowly, calmly, without fear, without panic, without any spike in our heart rates that would trigger the walls to close again. We need to walk toward the exit, or what passes for the exit in this place, and we need to do it in total silence, total stillness, total emotional control." Julian nodded, and they rose together, their movements synchronized, their bodies moving with a fluidity that suggested they were no longer two individuals, but rather a single organism. A unit that breathed as one and moved as one and thought as one. And they stepped toward the passage that led away from the chamber, away from the gallery, away from the center of the labyrinth and toward the surface, toward the light, toward the world of sun and air and the sanity of geometric space that did not shift and breathe and hunger for the fear of those who moved through it. But the passage that had been there when they entered the chamber was no longer there, or rather it was still there but was now different, was now leading in a different direction, was now opening onto a space that had not been visible before, that had not existed before, that had been created by their synchronized breathing, by their harmonic resonance, by the mathematical pattern that they had generated, and that the labyrinth had responded to by opening a path that was not the path they had taken to arrive, but was rather a new path, a direct path, a route that bypassed the spiral and led straight to the center, to the heart, to the place where the Minotaur waited and watched and hungered for the final act of the drama that had been playing out since the moment they descended into the darkness. "It's not the way out," Julian whispered, and his voice was trembling despite his efforts to maintain control, despite the breathing that was supposed to keep them calm, despite the synchronization that was supposed to keep them safe. "It's the way deeper, the way inward, the way toward the thing that we've been trying to avoid. And if we follow it, if we enter that space, we'll be in the center of the coil, in the heart of the labyrinth. In the place where the Minotaur is strongest and most aware and most hungry." "We don't have a choice," Helena said, and her voice was flat, resigned, the voice of a woman who had accepted the reality of their situation and was now merely calculating the odds, the probabilities, the chances of survival that were diminishing with each passing moment but were not yet zero, were not yet hopeless, were not yet completely beyond the realm of possibility. "The labyrinth has opened this path for us, has created this passage in response to our breathing, and that means it's inviting us, it's welcoming us, it's calling us to the center for a reason that we don't understand but that we can't ignore, because to ignore it would be to stay here in this chamber, waiting for the walls to close again, waiting for the Minotaur to come for us, waiting for the end that is inevitable but that might be postponed, might be negotiated, might be transformed into something other than the immediate annihilation that we've been fearing since the moment we entered this place." They moved into the passage, their steps slow and deliberate, their breathing synchronized, their bodies pressed close together for warmth and comfort, and the shared determination to survive that was their only weapon against the darkness and the hunger and the ancient pain of the creature that had created this path for them, that had opened this way for them, that was leading them toward a confrontation that neither of them wanted but both of them understood was unavoidable. The passage was short, shorter than any other passage they had traversed in the labyrinth, and it ended abruptly in a chamber that was circular, that was vast, that was dominated by a single object that stood in the center and glowed with a light that was not the light of their flashlights but was rather something else, something that emanated from the object itself. Something that was soft and pale and luminous in a way that suggested moonlight, starlight, the kind of illumination that existed in the world above, but had no place in the depths of the earth where the sun's rays could not penetrate, and the only light was artificial, was human, was the feeble glow of batteries and bulbs that were slowly dying, slowly fading, slowly surrendering to the darkness that was the natural state of the labyrinth. The object was a mirror, or at least it looked like a mirror, a vertical plane of reflective material that stood in the center of the chamber and cast back the image of the space around it, the image of Helena and Julian standing in the doorway, the image of the darkness that surrounded them. And in that mirror, Helena saw not merely the reflection of the chamber, but rather the truth of the chamber, the reality of the space that was hidden behind the illusion of stone and plaster and solid matter, the reality of the Minotaur's true form, the reality of what the creature had become after centuries of being folded by the geometry of the maze, after millennia of being shaped by the mathematics of the spiral, after endless ages of being twisted and compressed and transformed by the living machine that was the labyrinth itself. The Minotaur was not in the mirror, was not reflected in the mirror, was not visible as a separate entity standing in the chamber or behind the mirror or anywhere in the space that Helena could see with her eyes. The Minotaur was the mirror, was the reflection, was the space that the mirror reflected. And as Helena stepped closer, as she moved toward the center of the chamber with Julian following behind her, she realized that the mirror was not showing her the chamber but was rather showing her the Minotaur, was displaying the creature's form in the only way that the creature could be perceived, through the medium of reflection, through the language of geometry, through the mathematics of light and angle, and the particular properties of surfaces that absorbed some frequencies and reflected others. And the Minotaur was beautiful, was terrible, was both and neither, a form that combined the features of man and bull in ways that suggested not the clumsy hybrid of myth and legend, but rather the elegant fusion of two natures that had been merged by forces that understood both, that respected both, that had created something new from the combination of the old, something that was not merely a monster but was rather a work of art, a sculpture, a living masterpiece that had been carved from flesh and bone and the raw material of human consciousness, by the geometry of Daedalus and the hunger of the gods, and the endless suffering of a creature that had been transformed against its will into something that could not die, could not escape, could only exist in the space between life and death, between human and animal, between the world above and the world below, between the light and the darkness that defined its existence and shaped its form and determined its eternal and absolute hunger. "It doesn't want to kill us," Helena whispered, and her voice was soft, wondering, filled with an awe that was not fear but was rather recognition, understanding, the comprehension of something that transcended the categories of predator and prey and approached the realm of the sacred, the divine, the absolute truth that existed beyond the illusions of human perception. It wants us to see it, to understand it, to acknowledge what it is and what it has become and what it has suffered, and the killing is not the point. The consumption is not the point. The point is the recognition, the witness, the acknowledgement of the art that it has created from the geometry of its pain. Julian looked at her with eyes that were wide with confusion and fear, and the desperate need to understand what she was saying, what she was seeing, what she was comprehending that he could not yet grasp, and he stepped closer to the mirror and looked into it and saw what Helena had seen, saw the form of the Minotaur not as a monster but as a creation, not as a predator but as a victim, not as a threat but as a tragedy, and he felt his heart break, felt his fear dissolve, felt his understanding expand to encompass the reality of the creature that had been folded into this shape by forces beyond its control, by geometries that had altered its flesh and its mind and its very essence, transforming it from a human being into a god, from a prince into a prisoner, from a victim into the eternal curator of the gallery of the dead that was both its nourishment and its expression, its sustenance and its art, its survival and its purpose. The Minotaur moved, or rather the reflection moved, the image in the mirror shifting and changing as the creature emerged from the reflective surface, not by stepping through it but by becoming solid, by transitioning from the state of reflection to the state of reality. From the world behind the mirror to the world in front of it, and Helena saw it clearly for the first time, saw the human eyes that glowed with intelligence and pain, and the particular sorrow of a creature that had been transformed into something it was never meant to be. Saw the bull's head that bore the horns that had pinned Reed to the wall and stripped David of his limbs, and curated the gallery of bones that stretched back through centuries. Saw the body that was human in its posture and animal in its proportions, the hands that were fingers and hooves simultaneously, the legs that were straight and bent at the same time, the form that existed in a state of quantum superposition, of multiple possibilities, of the simultaneous existence of all its potential shapes, and the collapse of those shapes into the single form that Helena's consciousness could perceive, could process, could understand. And the Minotaur spoke, not with words but with vibrations, with subsonic frequencies that bypassed the ears and went directly into the nervous system, directly into the language centers of the brain, communicating not through sound but through meaning, not through language but through pure comprehension. And Helena understood. She understood everything. She understood the origin and the purpose and the eternal suffering of the creature that stood before her, and she understood what it wanted, what it needed, what it was asking for in its gravelly, guttural, rhythmic communication that was not speech, but was rather the expression of a consciousness that had transcended the need for words. It wanted them to acknowledge the art, to recognize the gallery, to understand that the bones were not merely remains but were rather sculptures, that the larders were not merely storage but were rather exhibitions, that the labyrinth was not merely a prison but was rather a museum, a temple, a cathedral dedicated to the memory of all the lives that had been consumed in the process of sustaining the Minotaur's existence, all the fear that had been harvested to feed the creature's eternal hunger, all the despair that had been transformed into the energy that kept the walls moving and the geometry shifting, and the consciousness alive in the darkness that was both its home and its hell. It wanted them to see the beauty in the arrangement, the symmetry in the spiral, the aesthetic perfection of the concentric circles that radiated outward from the center where the transformed skull sat upon its pedestal of black stone, and it wanted them to understand that this beauty was not accidental, was not incidental, was not the byproduct of a predator's feeding habits, but was rather deliberate, intentional, the product of a mind that had been driven to create by the same suffering that drove it to consume, the same pain that motivated its hunger, the same geometry that shaped its form and determined its existence. And most of all, it wanted them to know that they were not merely prey, not merely food, not merely the next items in an endless sequence of consumption, but were rather participants, witnesses, collaborators in the creation of a work that would outlast them. That would outlast everyone. That would exist as long as the labyrinth existed and the Minotaur endured, and the geometry of Daedalus continued to fold and shape and transform the raw material of human fear into the eternal art of the gallery of the dead. Helena stood before the creature, and she felt no fear, because the fear had been transformed into understanding, the terror into compassion, the desperate need to survive into the willingness to witness, to acknowledge, to recognize the reality of the Minotaur's existence and the legitimacy of its hunger, and the terrible beauty of the art that it had created from the geometry of its pain. And she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic and evidence and the survival instinct that had been screaming at her since the moment she entered the labyrinth, that the Minotaur would let them go, would allow them to leave, would open a path to the surface that was direct and true and free from the shifting geometry of the spiral. If they could only maintain this state of acknowledgement, this state of recognition, this state of witnessing, that was the only thing the creature truly wanted from them, the only payment it demanded for their passage, the only tribute it required for their freedom. "We see you," she said, and her voice was steady, strong, filled with a sincerity that was not feigned, not strategic, not the product of desperation, but was rather genuine, authentic, the true expression of a human being who had encountered something that transcended her categories of understanding, and had expanded to encompass it, to accept it, to witness it without judgment and without fear, and without the need to destroy it or escape it or deny its reality. "We see what you have made, and we understand why you have made it, and we acknowledge the beauty and the terror and the immense suffering that has produced this gallery, this art, this eternal testament to the geometry of pain that defines your existence." And the Minotaur looked at her with eyes that were human and bull and something else. Something that glowed with a light that was not physical but was rather spiritual, emotional, the light of recognition, of gratitude, of the particular satisfaction that comes from being seen, from being understood, from being witnessed by another consciousness that has grasped the truth of your existence and has not turned away in horror, but has rather embraced it in compassion. The creature moved, not toward them but away from them, not to attack but to open, to create, to shape a passage that had not been there before, a corridor that extended from the center of the chamber to a point of light that was visible in the distance, a light that was not artificial, was not flashlight, was not the pale luminescence of the mirror but was rather sunlight. Real sunlight, the golden radiance of the Cretan afternoon that filtered down through the cracks and crevices of the earth above, and illuminated the passage with a warmth that was life, that was hope, that was the promise of escape and survival, and the continuation of existence in a world that was governed by the laws of physics rather than the geometry of fear. And Helena understood that the passage was not merely a route to the surface, but was rather a response to her acknowledgement, a gift from the Minotaur in exchange for her witness, a reciprocal gesture that balanced the scales of their interaction and allowed them to leave without becoming part of the gallery, without joining the collection, without adding their bones to the concentric circles that radiated outward from the center of the labyrinth. "We need to go," Julian whispered, and his voice was urgent, desperate, the voice of a man who had seen the light and was now terrified that it would vanish, that the passage would close, that the Minotaur would change its mind and consume them after all. And Helena nodded, slowly, reluctantly. Because some part of her did not want to leave, did not want to abandon the creature to its eternal suffering, did not want to return to the world above where the Minotaur's existence would be denied, and its gallery would be forgotten, and its art would be dismissed as myth and legend and the superstition of primitive minds. But the larger part of her, the part that wanted to live, that wanted to see the sun again, that wanted to walk on solid ground that did not shift and breathe and hunger for her fear, compelled her to move, to walk, to follow Julian toward the light that was growing brighter with each step, that was promising salvation, that was offering escape from the darkness and the geometry and the eternal hunger of the thing that was not a monster, but was rather a victim, not a predator but was rather a prisoner, not a beast, but was rather a man who had been folded into a shape that he was never meant to hold and would never be allowed to escape. They walked toward the light, and the Minotaur walked with them, not beside them but behind them, not pushing them but rather escorting them, guiding them, ensuring that they did not stray from the path, that they did not become lost in the shifting geometry of the labyrinth, that they did not succumb to the fear that was their natural response to the creature's presence, and that would trigger the walls to close and the passage to vanish and the opportunity for escape to be lost forever. And as they walked, as they moved through the corridor that was straight and true and stable in ways that no other passage in the labyrinth had been, Helena became aware of the creature's proximity, became aware of the heat that radiated from its body, the musk that marked its passage, the rhythmic vibration of its breathing that synchronized with her own, that matched her heartbeat, that created a harmonic resonance between them that was not fear but was rather connection. Not terror but was rather communion, not the relationship of predator and prey, but was rather the relationship of witness and witnessed, of acknowledger and acknowledged, of two consciousnesses that had touched each other across the boundary of form and understanding, and had found in that touch something that transcended the categories of human and animal, of hunter and hunted, of the living and the dead. She felt the brush of its horns against her back, not piercing, not pinning, but rather grazing, touching, making contact with a gentleness that was unbearable in its implication, because it suggested that the creature could have killed her at any moment, could have consumed her at any moment, could have added her to the gallery at any moment, but had chosen not to. Had chosen to let her live, had chosen to grant her the gift of survival in exchange for the gift of witness that she had offered, the acknowledgement of its existence and its art, and its eternal suffering that was the only thing it had ever truly wanted from any of the thousands of human beings who had entered its domain and become its food. The passage led upward, climbing through the bedrock in a spiral that was not the confusing spiral of the labyrinth's hunting geometry, but was rather the simple spiral of a staircase, a natural formation that had been shaped by water and time, and the slow geological processes that created caves and caverns and the hidden spaces of the earth. And they climbed with a speed that was born of renewed hope, of the proximity of the surface, of the light that was growing brighter with each step, each turn, each meter of ascent that carried them farther from the center and closer to the world above. And the Minotaur climbed with them, its bulk somehow fitting through passages that should have been too narrow for its size, its form somehow compressing itself into spaces that should have been too small for its mass. And Helena realized that the creature was not bound by the laws of physics that constrained ordinary matter, was not limited by the properties of solid substance that defined the human world, but was rather fluid, adaptable, capable of existing in multiple states simultaneously, of being large and small, solid and liquid, present and absent, all at the same time, in the same place, in the same moment of perception that was the only reality that the labyrinth acknowledged. They climbed for what felt like hours, or perhaps it was minutes, time having lost its meaning in the darkness of the lower levels, and only now beginning to reassert itself as the light grew brighter, and the air grew fresher, and the sounds of the world above began to filter down through the cracks and crevices of the earth. The sounds of wind and birds and the distant murmur of the sea that surrounded Crete and had surrounded it for millennia, that would continue to surround it for millennia more, long after the labyrinth had collapsed and the Minotaur had died, and the gallery of the dead had been forgotten by everyone except the stones and the dust and the eternal patience of time. And then they emerged, burst through a final crack in the rock, and found themselves in the sunlight of Crete, in the warmth of the afternoon, in the world of solid ground and stable geometry, and the sanity of a universe that did not shift and breathe and hunger for the fear of those who moved through it. They stumbled forward, fell to their knees, pressed their palms against the earth that was warm and dry and unmoving, and they breathed the air that was fresh and clean and free from the musk and the rot, and the particular odor of the labyrinth that had permeated their clothes and their skin and their lungs during the days and nights of their descent. They were alive, they were free. They had escaped the impossible geometry and the eternal hunger and the curated gallery of the dead. And they were physically scarred and mentally broken, but they were here. They were breathing. They were existing in the world above where the sun shone and the wind blew and the laws of physics held sway. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the sum total of what they needed to feel grateful for, to feel thankful for, to feel alive for in a way that they had never felt before, in a way that only those who have faced annihilation and survived can feel. The particular intensity of existence that comes from having brushed against death and been granted a reprieve, a postponement, a temporary extension of the game that would continue until the final hand was played, and the final bet was called, and the final debt was paid. But as they knelt in the dirt, as they gasped for air, as they felt the warmth of the sun on their faces and the solidity of the earth beneath their knees, Helena became aware of something that made her blood run cold, that made her heart stop, that made her understanding of their escape crumble into doubt and fear, and the slowly dawning realization that they had not escaped at all, had not been freed at all, had not been granted the reprieve that they had believed in, but had rather been given something else, something that was not freedom but was rather a different kind of imprisonment, a different kind of hunting ground, a different kind of gallery that extended beyond the labyrinth and into the world above. She looked back at the entrance to the sub-labyrinth, at the crack in the rock from which they had emerged, and she saw the Minotaur standing there, not emerging, not following, but rather watching, waiting, positioned at the threshold with its human eyes and its bull's head and its form that was both and neither. And she understood that the creature could not leave its domain, could not cross the boundary between the world below and the world above, could not walk in the sunlight of Crete because the sunlight would destroy it, would unmake it, would reverse the geometry that had folded it into its current shape and return it to the human form that it had lost millennia ago, and that this inability to leave was not a weakness, but was rather the source of its power, the foundation of its existence, the condition that allowed it to endure in the darkness and the cold and the eternal hunger that defined its life. The Minotaur looked at her with eyes that were filled with something that was not anger, not threat, not the predatory focus of a creature that was preparing to attack, but was rather something else, something that Helena could not name but could recognize, something that was almost like gratitude, almost like farewell, almost like the acknowledgement of a debt that had been paid, and a bond that had been formed, and a relationship that would persist even across the boundary of worlds, even across the separation of the surface and the depths, even across the infinite distance that separated the living from the dead and the human from the divine. And then the Minotaur opened its mouth, not to roar, not to scream, not to emit the guttural vibrations that had communicated its history and its purpose and its eternal suffering, but rather to produce a sound that was new, that was different, that was unlike anything Helena had heard in the labyrinth or in the world above, or in any dream or nightmare or fevered imagining of her fevered mind. It was a hum, a low vibrating hum that resonated in the stone and the earth and the air itself. A sound that was not music but was rather the suggestion of music, not language but was rather the suggestion of language, not meaning but was rather the suggestion of meaning. And it seemed to say, without words, without concepts, without any of the tools of human communication, that the escape was real, that the freedom was real, that the gift had been given and the debt had been paid and the transaction was complete. But it also seemed to say, in the same breath, in the same vibration, in the same subsonic frequency that bypassed the ears and went directly into the consciousness, that the geometry of the experience had permanently altered them, had changed them, had folded them in ways that were not visible but were nonetheless real, not physical but were nonetheless profound, and that they would never again be able to perceive the world in the way they had perceived it before, would never again be able to walk on solid ground without feeling the movement beneath their feet, would never again be able to look at a wall without wondering if it was breathing, would never again be able to enter a dark space without expecting the geometry to shift, and the dimensions to change, and the labyrinth to manifest itself in the most unexpected places, at the most unexpected times, in the most unexpected forms. The hum continued, rising and falling in a pattern that suggested laughter, not the laughter of amusement or joy, but rather the laughter of recognition, of understanding, of the particular humor that comes from seeing the irony of a situation that is too terrible to be tragic and too absurd to be serious. And Helena felt the vibration in her bones, in her blood, in the synapses of her brain. And she knew that the Minotaur was laughing at them, was laughing at her, was laughing at the human beings who had entered its domain seeking treasure and had found instead truth, who had come seeking art and had become art, who had descended into the darkness as scientists and had emerged as witnesses to something that science could not explain and art could not capture and language could not express. And as the hum faded, as the vibration subsided, as the Minotaur withdrew into the darkness of the labyrinth, and the crack in the rock sealed itself with a sound like stone grinding against stone, like a door closing, like the final page of a book being turned and the cover being shut, and the story being consigned to the silence of the library where it would wait for the next reader, the next explorer, the next victim who would enter the labyrinth and discover that the geometry of fear was not a prison, but was rather a perspective, not a trap, but was rather a truth, and that the only way to escape it was to acknowledge it, to witness it, to understand that the Minotaur was not the enemy but was rather the teacher, not the predator but was rather the lesson, and that the fear it consumed was not merely the chemical signature of human terror, but was rather the raw material of transformation, the substance from which understanding was forged and compassion was shaped, and the eternal art of the gallery of the dead was created, maintained, curated with a patience that was older than human civilization and would outlast it by millennia. Helena stood in the sunlight of Crete and she felt the ground beneath her feet, and it was solid, it was stable, it was unmoving, and yet she knew, with a certainty that transcended physical sensation and approached the realm of intuition, of memory, of the particular knowledge that comes from having touched something that cannot be touched, and seen something that cannot be seen, and understood something that cannot be understood. That the solidity was illusory, that the stability was temporary, that the unmoving earth was merely the negative space between the movements, the pause between the breaths, the silence between the notes of a music that was eternal and omnipresent and utterly indifferent to the concerns of human beings who walked upon its surface, and believed themselves safe from the geometry that existed beneath. She would never feel level again, never feel stable, never feel truly at home in a world that did not shift and breathe and hunger for her fear, because she had been folded by the labyrinth, had been shaped by the geometry, had been transformed by the experience of acknowledging the Minotaur and witnessing its art and understanding its suffering. And the folding had left its mark upon her, had altered her perception, had changed the way she saw the world and the way she moved through it, and the way she understood the relationship between the solid and the fluid, the fixed and the shifting, the human and the divine. She was safe. They were both safe. They had escaped the labyrinth and survived the Minotaur and emerged into the sunlight of a world that was governed by laws they could understand and predict and rely upon. But they would never be the same, never be whole, never be free from the geometry that had been imprinted upon their consciousness by the touch of the creature that was not a monster but was rather a masterpiece, not a predator but was rather a prisoner, and the hum that the Minotaur had emitted as they parted, the vibrating laugh that had resonated in their bones and their blood and their minds, would stay with them forever, would echo in their dreams and their waking moments and their most ordinary perceptions, a reminder that the world was larger and stranger and more terrible than they had ever imagined, and that the geometry of fear was not a place but was rather a state of mind, not a labyrinth but was rather a way of seeing, and that once it had been acknowledged, once it had been witnessed, once it had been understood, it could never be forgotten, never be denied, never be escaped, because it was part of them now, folded into their consciousness the way the Minotaur had been folded into its shape. And they would carry it with them always, in every step, in every breath, in every moment of their continued existence in a world that was safe but would never feel safe again, that was level but would never feel level again, that was sane but would never feel sane again, because they had seen the truth that lurked beneath the surface of reality, had touched the art that existed in the negative space between the things that were visible, had heard the hum of the Minotaur's laughter in the silence that followed their escape, and they knew, with a knowledge that was deeper than faith and more certain than reason, that the labyrinth was still there, still waiting, still hungry, and that someday, somehow, they would return to it, would descend into it, would become part of the gallery that stretched back through centuries and forward through centuries more. Because the geometry of fear was eternal, the Minotaur's hunger was absolute, and the only escape that was possible was the escape into understanding, into witness, into the acknowledgement of the art that was created from the suffering of a creature that had been folded into a shape it was never meant to hold and would never be allowed to escape, and that hummed its eternal laughter in the darkness beneath the earth, beneath the sea. Beneath the light of the Cretan sun that shone upon Helena's face and Julian's face, and warmed their skin without ever reaching the coldness that had settled in their hearts, the geometry that had twisted their perception, the knowledge that they were safe but would never feel safe again, never feel level again, never feel truly human again, because they had been touched by the Minotaur and the touch had changed them, transformed them, folded them into shapes that were not yet visible but were nonetheless real, and the folding would continue, would persist, would echo through their lives like the hum of the creature's laughter, until the final moment when the walls closed and the gallery opened and the art was complete, and the witness was welcomed into the collection that was eternal, absolute, and utterly, completely, inevitably final. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.